There is a place in Kentucky that has been swallowing people whole for longer than recorded history can account for. Not metaphorically, not as myth. Literally, a darkness so complete and so ancient that it bends the imagination just standing at its mouth and staring in. Mammoth Cave stretches for more than 400 miles of mapped passage beneath the hills of south-central Kentucky, making it the longest known cave system on Earth. Longer than any other by a factor that should make you stop and reconsider everything you assumed about what lives underground in this country. But here is the part that the park brochures mention only briefly, if they mention it at all. Native peoples were not simply aware of Mammoth Cave. They went inside it, deep inside it. They carried torches of braided plant fiber and rendered animal fat more than 3 miles into absolute darkness, and they did things in there that no archaeologist has fully explained. They mined minerals by hand. They left behind woven sandals, reed firebrands, wooden bowls, gourd containers, and the ash of fires lit in chambers so far from the entrance that the journey there and back would have taken the better part of a day by torchlight alone. Some of those objects have been dated to over 3,000 years ago, some potentially older, and the people who made them warned every generation that came after them about what lay beneath, that the cave was alive, that it went further than any person had yet traveled, that something waited at the deeper end of things that deserved respect, not curiosity. Scientists finally looked, and what they found has quietly rewritten what we thought we knew about the ancient history of North America. Before we go further, I want to acknowledge whoever is watching right now. Some of you are already in the dark. Some of you have rain outside or a city coming through the window. This channel exists because the history that gets taught is not always the history the evidence supports. It is often the version that is most convenient. If you want the version that goes underneath, the one the record actually points to when you look closely, stay with this. Subscribing costs nothing. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The first thing you need to understand about Mammoth Cave is how geology made it possible for a civilization to exist inside a hill without the outside world ever knowing. The cave sits beneath the Chester upland of south-central Kentucky, carved over millions of years by slightly acidic groundwater moving through soluble limestone. The Mammoth Cave Plateau is composed of what geologists call the Gherkin, State Genevieve, and Street. Louis limestone formations, laid down in shallow tropical seas roughly 330 million years ago when this region of North America sat near the equator. That limestone, hundreds of feet thick in places, is what the water ate. Over millions of years, the Green River and its tributaries cut down through the landscape, drawing the water table lower and lower, draining the passages above, and leaving behind a system of dry corridors, domed chambers, and plunging shafts that look almost architectural in their regularity. Not because anyone built them, because water is patient and limestone is not. The cave breathes. That is not a metaphor either. As outdoor temperatures shift through the seasons, the pressure differential between the cave's interior and the surface atmosphere causes air to flow in and out through the various entrances. In winter, warm cave air rises and escapes, drawing cold surface air in through lower openings. In summer, the process reverses. Anyone who spent time near the historic entrance would have felt that exhalation, that steady, cool breath emerging from the dark even on the hottest August afternoon. Indigenous peoples noticed. They had been noticing for a very long time. Archaeological evidence of human activity inside Mammoth Cave begins roughly 4,000 years ago, during a period archaeologists call the Green River Archaic. The Green River culture was not a single unified people in any modern political sense. It was a loose term describing the communities that occupied the river valley and its surrounding uplands during a period of relative climatic stability following the end of the last ice age. These were people who hunted white-tailed deer and turkey, who gathered nuts, roots, berries, and seeds along the bottomlands, who built substantial middens of freshwater mussel shells along the Green River banks, and who maintained extensive social networks that moved materials like copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the southern Appalachians, and marine shells from the Gulf Coast across hundreds of miles of interior North America. They were not primitive, they were organized. They were connected, and they chose to go underground. The earliest confirmed human presence in Mammoth Cave comes from the vestibule, the wide entrance chamber visible from the main historic entrance today. Charcoal deposits in the sediment there have been radiocarbon dated to around 3,500 to 4,000 years before the present. But the people who left that charcoal were not camping at the mouth. They were using the entrance as a waypoint. The real evidence of serious, purposeful human activity lies miles deeper, in passages with names like the Gothic Avenue, Mammoth Dome, and the Rotunda, where archaeologists beginning in the early 19th century found extraordinary concentrations of prehistoric objects that nobody had any good explanation for. The objects were not weapons. They were not hunting tools. They were the tools of extraction and transport. Wooden bowls, reed torches in various stages of burn, some used down to a stub no longer than a hand's width, others still half intact as if set down and simply never retrieved. Gourd containers sealed with plant fiber stoppers, braided cordage of remarkable quality, tight and uniform, showing familiarity with twisting techniques that anthropologists recognize from archaic period sites across the eastern woodlands, woven reed mats, and sandals. Dozens of pairs of sandals, found in passages 3 and 4 miles from the entrance, woven from plant fibers that have been identified as species native to the upland forest above the cave. The sandals fit adult human feet. They show wear patterns consistent with walking on the rough limestone floors of cave passages. Someone walked miles into the dark in those shoes, did what they came to do, and either left or did not come back. The mineral they were after was primarily gypsum, calcium sulfate in its hydrated crystalline form. It forms on limestone cave walls as water moves slowly through the rock and evaporates, leaving behind thin white deposits in floral patterns called gypsum flowers, in needle-like formations called selenite crystals, in crusts of compacted white powder. The indigenous miners scraped it from the walls using mussel shells and wooden tools, collected it in the gourds and bowls they carried with them, and brought it out through miles of darkness. Why they wanted it is one of the questions archaeologists have spent decades debating. Gypsum has been found associated with ritual contexts at surface sites throughout the region. It appears in burial contexts, mixed with other minerals in pigment preparations, placed near skeletal remains in ways that suggest cosmological significance. Some researchers have proposed it had medicinal applications. Others suggest it was used in body paint or ceremonial decoration. The honest answer is that we do not know exactly what it meant to the people who went to such extraordinary lengths to obtain it. We know only that they thought it was worth risking the dark, because the dark inside Mammoth Cave is a specific kind of dark. This is not the dark of a room with the lights off, where your eyes adjust and outlines emerge, and spatial relationships become readable. In the interior of Mammoth Cave, more than a few hundred feet from any entrance, the darkness is absolute. Not dim, not shadowy, absolute. No photon reaches you from any external source. Your visual cortex, starved of input, begins generating its own imagery. Miners and explorers who have spent extended time in deep cave darkness without artificial light report visual hallucinations, a sense of spatial disorientation so profound it becomes impossible to determine which direction is up without touching a surface, and a deepening auditory sensitivity in which the sound of your own heartbeat becomes uncomfortably loud. The indigenous people who entered Mammoth Cave 3 and 4 miles from the entrance understood this. They prepared for it. The torches they carried were engineered objects, not random bundles of sticks. They were composed of braided plant fiber with specific burn characteristics, lit with fire carefully maintained and transported, probably in containers designed to protect the flame from the cave's internal airflow. This took knowledge. This took practice. This took a tradition of passing information about the cave from person to person across generations. That tradition is what the warnings came from. The specific warnings associated with Mammoth Cave are documented in a handful of historical sources, none of them complete. All of them filtered through the perspectives of people who were recording what they heard from indigenous informants, without necessarily understanding its context or significance. The earliest written reference to indigenous relationships with the cave comes from the surveys conducted in the late 18th century as Euro-American settlement pushed into Kentucky. Surveyor accounts from the 1790s and early 1800s occasionally mention native guides who knew the cave's existence but who expressed reluctance to enter. One account, recorded in a private letter held at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville and cited by cave historian Roger Brucker in his work on the cave's pre-European history, describes a Shawnee guide refusing to enter the cave on behalf of a surveying party and explaining, as best the surveyor could render it in translation, that the cave had no end and that the things living in its deeper passages were not to be disturbed by the living. That word, living, was the surveyor's translation. What the Shawnee guide actually said, in what language, with what specific vocabulary, has not survived. But the structure of the warning is consistent with what ethnographers recorded from multiple native nations across the eastern woodlands throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Not a prohibition based on fear of physical danger, though physical danger was real and acknowledged. A prohibition based on something else. A recognition that the cave existed in a different relationship to time and to the world than the surface did. That certain things occupying the deeper passages were not hostile, exactly, but were old in a way that demanded acknowledgement, not investigation. The Shawnee had deep historical ties to Kentucky, which they called Kentarton, a hunting ground so significant that multiple nations held interests in it, and conflicts over access to it were essentially continuous. The historical Shawnee are a northeastern Algonquian-speaking people whose origins are debated among scholars but whose 18th century territories centered on the Ohio River Valley, with significant communities in what is now southern Ohio, western Pennsylvania, and the northern edges of Kentucky. They were not the original miners of Mammoth Cave. The archaeology suggests the intensive prehistoric use of the cave predates the historical Shawnee by at least 1,000 years. But the Shawnee had occupied the surrounding landscape long enough to have inherited a body of knowledge about the cave, including an understanding that it was not simply a geological feature but a place with significance that extended beyond the purely physical. Cherokee oral traditions also reference the cave region, though with somewhat different framing. The Cherokee, whose historical territories included much of the southern Appalachians and whose hunting ranges extended into what is now central Kentucky, associated certain cave systems in the region with entrances to an underworld inhabited by beings they called the Yunwi Amayini, the water dwellers, a category of powerful spiritual entities believed to occupy subterranean waters and underground passages. The specific application of this tradition to Mammoth Cave is not documented with the same directness as some other references, but ethnographers working with Cherokee communities in the late 19th century recorded repeated mentions of a great cave in the north, one that went deeper than any person had fully traveled, and that was known to contain passages through which one could hear sounds that had no source visible in the torchlight. Sounds. That detail appears in multiple independent accounts from multiple native nations over multiple decades of collection, and it is the detail that modern researchers have found most interesting to sit with. Because Mammoth Cave is, among its many remarkable qualities, an extraordinarily acoustically complex environment, sound behaves differently underground than it does on the surface. In large dome chambers, certain frequencies reverberate and amplify in ways that produce the impression of voices, of footsteps, of presence. In narrow passages, the cave's own geological activity, the slow movement of water through fissures, the settling of rock, the subtle thermodynamic processes of a system breathing, generate sounds that echo and reflect and become unrecognizable as having any natural source. Researchers in the field of archaeoacoustics, the study of the acoustic properties of ancient sites and their potential significance to past cultures, have documented strong correlations at other sites between locations of intensive rock art or ritual activity and locations with unusual acoustic properties. The question of whether the prehistoric users of Mammoth Cave selected specific chambers for their activity, partly on the basis of acoustic phenomena, is one that has not been fully investigated. But the geographic concentration of prehistoric objects in certain chambers, which also happen to have unusual domed structures that create notable acoustic effects, has not been lost on the researchers who have spent time inside. In the chamber called Grand Central Station, more than 2 miles from the historic entrance, the domed ceiling creates a reverberation that sends sound traveling in unexpected directions. A voice spoken at normal volume in one corner of the chamber can be heard clearly at the opposite wall while being entirely inaudible from the center. The prehistoric activity in this chamber was dense, torch ash, gypsum deposits showing clear evidence of removal, mussel shell scrapers, and in one corner, partially buried in sediment, the remains of what appeared to be a fire ring not associated with any passage to an adjacent section. A fire built not to provide light for travel but to exist in a fixed location, to burn in a particular spot, in a particular chamber, for a reason the builders did not leave written instructions about. Thomas Barr, the University of Tennessee zoologist who conducted the first systematic biological survey of Mammoth Cave in the 1960s, noted in his field records that the pattern of prehistoric torch drop sites did not correspond neatly to the most efficient routes through the cave. Efficient routes, the paths a modern cave explorer would take to traverse the passage system with minimum effort, existed and were navigable. The prehistoric users did not always take them. They sometimes moved laterally through side passages that added considerable distance to a journey, then returned to the main corridor. Barr did not propose an explanation for this in his biological survey. He noted it as a behavioral anomaly and moved on. But the observation stuck in the literature and was picked up by later archaeologists who had begun to think about the cave not purely as a resource extraction site, but as a landscape with its own internal logic. The idea that Mammoth Cave was navigated according to a logic we do not yet fully understand is not fringe archaeology. It is the current position of the researchers who have spent the most time with the evidence. The prehistoric users of Mammoth Cave did not simply go in, get what they needed, and come back out. They moved through the cave in ways that suggest familiarity, specificity, and purpose that goes beyond extraction. They visited some chambers repeatedly, leaving stratified deposits of material across what the radiocarbon dates suggest were multiple visits over centuries. They avoided others entirely, even when those chambers were adjacent to heavily used corridors. The pattern, like the warnings transmitted through oral tradition, suggests that the people who used Mammoth Cave thought of it as a place with internal differentiation, with some sections appropriate for human activity and others that were not. The elder traditions collected by anthropologists working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries consistently describe a cosmology in which the underground is not simply a space beneath the surface. It is a distinct world, governed by its own rules, inhabited by its own powers, and connected to the surface world through specific nodes that function as both entrances and thresholds. You did not simply walk into those nodes. You prepared. You observed protocols. You knew which passages were yours to enter and which belonged to others whose nature was different from your own. For communities that had maintained a relationship with Mammoth Cave over generations, this cosmological framework was not abstract theology. It was practical knowledge. The cave had killed people. The cave's passages extended into darkness that no single torch could illuminate. The cave flooded during heavy rain events, turning lower passages into rivers that could trap and drown anyone who had moved too deeply inside. The cave could be navigated, but it required respect for its character. The cosmological language of spiritual prohibition and the practical language of physical danger were not separate things. They were two registers for expressing the same truth. The cave was not safe. To treat it as safe was to misunderstand what it was, but the warnings were not only about danger. That is what the researchers who finally read them carefully began to understand. The warnings carried information. They said, in the vocabulary available to the cultures transmitting them, that the cave extended further than human beings had yet traveled, that something waited at the deep end of things, and that the people who had gone deepest had brought back knowledge about the nature of the Earth that the surface world needed but could not easily hold. Those warnings turned out to be correct in ways that would have been impossible to verify until scientists developed the tools to look. The systematic scientific exploration of Mammoth Cave did not begin in earnest until the early 19th century, and its early history is a story of commercial tourism, white ownership disputes, and the labor of enslaved black guides whose knowledge of the cave was foundational to everything that followed. The cave was commercially open to visitors in 1816, operated by a succession of owners who recognized its potential as a spectacle. The guides who led those early tours, men like Stephen Bishop, Matt Bransford, Nick Bransford, and later the Bransford family across multiple generations, were enslaved people whose familiarity with the cave's passages was unmatched by any of the white men who claimed legal ownership of the land above. Stephen Bishop in particular is a figure whose historical importance cannot be overstated, and whose recognition in the mainstream narrative of American exploration has been systematically underpowered. Bishop was enslaved by Franklin Gorin, the first significant commercial developer of the cave, and later by John Croghan, a physician who purchased the property in 1839. Bishop was not simply a guide in the tourist sense. He was an explorer in the fullest meaning of the word. He mapped the cave's passages using his own observations, created a hand-drawn map that was published in A.C. Bullitt's Rambles in the Mammoth Cave in 1845 and remained the most accurate representation of the cave's known passages for decades. And he crossed what was then called the bottomless pit, a feature that had halted previous exploration attempts, by constructing a bridge from available materials and proceeding into territory no prior explorer, white or black, had documented. He named passages, chambers, and features. He developed the navigational logic of the cave through sustained engagement with it over years. And he did all of this while legally owned by another person who profited from his knowledge. The Bransford family continued this tradition after emancipation, with multiple generations serving as guides and informal researchers of the cave into the 20th century. Matt Bransford, who was enslaved at Mammoth Cave before the Civil War, guided visitors for decades after emancipation and was still working in the cave in the early 20th century. His descendants continued the association. Henry Bransford, born in the 1890s, became one of the most knowledgeable cave guides of the mid-20th century. The knowledge held by the Bransford family, accumulated over multiple generations of sustained engagement with the cave, represented a form of institutional memory that formal scientific exploration repeatedly drew upon while rarely crediting. The early exploration period, roughly 1,820 through 1,880, focused heavily on the commercially accessible portions of the cave, the impressive formations and large chambers near the historic entrance that could be shown to paying visitors within the bounds of a comfortable excursion. The deeper reaches of the cave, miles from the entrance in passages that required hours of travel even for experienced cavers, were explored in a patchwork fashion by individuals whose accounts were sometimes published and sometimes not, sometimes accurate and sometimes embellished for effect. The genuine geography of the cave's deep interior was not systematically understood until the 20th century, and not fully mapped until the 1970s, when the Cave Research Foundation began the sustained exploratory program that eventually connected Mammoth Cave with the neighboring Flint Ridge system in 1972, producing the first confirmed demonstration that the cave system was far larger than anyone had previously documented. The Flint Ridge connection was the moment the scientific community was forced to reckon with the scale of what they were dealing with. Before the connection, Mammoth Cave and the Flint Ridge cave system were understood as separate entities. Mammoth Cave had roughly 45 miles of mapped passage. The Flint Ridge system, mapped by a different group of cavers, had a similar length. When Patricia Crowther, John Wilcox, Richard Zopf, Gary Eller, and Tom Brucker made the connection through a water-filled crawlway called Hanson's Lost River on the 9th of September, 1972, they did not simply add two numbers together. They revealed that the apparent separation of the systems was an artifact of incomplete mapping, not a geological reality. The cave was continuous, and continuous in a way that meant its total extent was vastly larger than the sum of its known parts. The lesson the Flint Ridge connection taught, and that subsequent decades of exploration have continuously reinforced, is that Mammoth Cave's boundaries are not established. Every few years, cavers reach a passage that extends beyond the previously known system and follow it to another connection, another undiscovered section, another set of chambers and corridors that have never been entered by any human being in recorded history. The current mapped length of approximately 420 miles, as of the most recent systematic survey data, almost certainly underestimates the system's true extent. There are segments of cave passage that have been visually identified but not yet traversed. There are hydrological surveys suggesting subsurface drainage patterns that would require a significantly larger cave system to produce. There are sections of the cave where airflow analysis suggests major undiscovered passage beyond what is currently known. The cave is not finished being discovered. It is, in all probability, the longest cave system on Earth by a comfortable margin, and most of it has never been entered by a human being. The oral traditions of the native peoples who maintained relationships with this landscape said, across multiple independent transmissions over multiple generations, that the cave extended further than human beings had yet traveled. They were right. The scientific reckoning with the cave's true scale coincided, not by accident, with a renewed scholarly interest in the archaeological materials that had been accumulating in museum collections since the early 19th century. The early excavations of Mammoth Cave were not what any modern archaeologist would call careful. They were not really excavations in the scientific sense at all. Early tourists and commercial operators, aware that the cave's passages contained extraordinary pre-Columbian objects, removed those objects with a casual acquisitiveness that characterized 19th century engagement with Native American heritage. Some objects ended up in Smithsonian collections. Some ended up in European museums. Some ended up in private collections scattered across the country, whose present locations are difficult to trace. The sediment context that would have allowed precise spatial and stratigraphic analysis of those objects, the soil matrix that a modern excavation would have preserved and examined in detail, was largely destroyed in the course of their removal. What was saved, however, along with the objects themselves, was enough to establish that the prehistoric use of Mammoth Cave was not casual or accidental. The density of material in certain passages, the geographic specificity of that distribution, and the physical condition of the objects, which in the cave's stable environment had survived thousands of years with almost no degradation, combined to tell a story about organized, purposeful, sustained human activity in a subterranean environment that should have been, by any ordinary reckoning, extremely hostile to human presence. The preservation inside Mammoth Cave is, in fact, one of its most scientifically significant qualities. The cave maintains a nearly constant temperature of approximately 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, with very low humidity in the dry passages and virtually no light that would degrade organic materials. Objects left in the dry interior passages of Mammoth Cave can survive for thousands of years in essentially the same condition as when they were deposited. This is why the sandals and torches and wooden bowls recovered from the cave's interior retain their structural integrity in a way that comparable objects from surface archaeological sites almost never do. The cave is, in effect, a natural museum with climate control more stable than anything built by modern technology. The indigenous people who used it could not have known the chemistry behind that preservation, but they would have observed the practical fact of it. Things left in the cave did not rot, they endured. The deliberate placement of certain objects deep in the cave's passages, away from the extraction zones and not associated with travel routes, has been interpreted by some researchers as evidence of intentional caching or deposition. Not storage for later retrieval, but placement with a different intention entirely. The distinction matters because caching and ritual deposition are not the same behavior, even when they produce similar material signatures. Caching is utilitarian. You put something away to get it later. Deposition in the ritual sense is permanent. You put something in a place because the place receives it and holds it, and the act of giving it is the point. There are objects in the prehistoric assemblage from Mammoth Cave that are extremely difficult to explain as cached utilitarian supplies. A small human effigy carved from clay, recovered from a passage more than 3 miles from the entrance, was not a mining tool. A bundle of materials, including a gourd, a length of carefully plaited cordage, and several items whose identification is contested in the literature, but may include medicinal plants, recovered from a chamber where no gypsum extraction was conducted, does not fit any model of resource extraction. These objects were brought a very long way into complete darkness, placed in specific locations, and left. The ethnographic parallel is immediate. Virtually every indigenous tradition of the eastern woodlands that includes engagement with underground spaces describes practices of leaving offerings in those spaces. The specific protocols varied enormously between different cultural traditions, but the underlying logic was consistent. Certain underground spaces were not simply geological features, they were presences. They received things. The act of entering and leaving something behind was part of the relationship between the human community above ground and whatever inhabited or represented the world below. Disturbing those deposits, removing what had been given, was not simply a violation of cultural protocol. It was a rupture in a relationship that had kept things in balance. This is not the language of modern archaeology. It is the language of the oral traditions that the early warning accounts were transmitting. And it is, increasingly, the language that archaeologists working in collaboration with descendant communities have found most productive for understanding what the material evidence is actually describing. The Mammoth Cave region sits within the cultural territory of several nations that maintain living relationships with the southeastern and midwestern United States. The Cherokee, whose historical territory extended from the southern Appalachians north into Kentucky and Tennessee, the Shawnee, whose historical presence in the Ohio Valley gave them significant engagement with the Kentucky landscape, the Chickasaw, whose influence extended north from their core territory into the western Kentucky region, the Osage, whose traditional territory west of the Mississippi nevertheless brought them into contact with the broader cultural sphere of the Mississippian and woodland period cultures that had used the cave. None of these nations held what we would call legal title to the Mammoth Cave region at the time of Euro-American colonization, partly because the colonial legal framework simply did not recognize the forms of relationship to landscape that these nations maintained, and partly because the region functioned as shared hunting ground in the historical period in ways that distributed rather than concentrated exclusive territorial claims. But the absence of colonial-era documented land title is not the same thing as the absence of historical connection. The descendant communities of the peoples who spent time in this landscape over the course of thousands of years carry knowledge about that landscape in their oral traditions, in their ceremonial practices, in their cosmological frameworks, that does not require documentary evidence to be real and significant. The warnings about Mammoth Cave were transmitted through exactly these channels, not in written records, not in officially recognized legal documents, but in the accumulated practical and spiritual knowledge of peoples who had been paying attention to this place for longer than any other human beings had been paying attention to anything in this part of the world. When scientists began, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, to take those oral traditions seriously as potential sources of information, rather than simply as ethnographic curiosities, the results were startling. One of the most significant developments in the study of Mammoth Cave's ancient history came from an unlikely direction: paleontology. The cave contains fossil material, the bones of creatures that lived in and around the cave during the Pleistocene epoch, and the analysis of those fossil assemblages has produced findings with direct implications for understanding the human use of the cave and the oral traditions associated with it. Deep within Mammoth Cave's passages, beyond the zones of documented prehistoric human activity, paleontologists have recovered fossil remains of species that were extinct by the time any historically documented human population occupied the region. Giant ground sloths, peccaries, tapirs. flat-headed peccaries, Harlan's ground sloth, American mastodons, species whose last known presence in North America dates to the late Pleistocene, the period ending approximately 12,000 years ago, that coincides with the end of the last glacial maximum and the earliest confirmed human presence in the Americas. The presence of these fossils inside Mammoth Cave's passages, in some cases deep within the system, is consistent with the cave having functioned as an animal refuge during the climatic extremes of the Pleistocene, when surface conditions in this region would have included periods of dramatically colder temperatures, reduced vegetation, and restricted surface water availability. The oral traditions of multiple eastern woodlands nations include accounts of large animals that no longer exist, animals with specific characteristics that correspond closely to species known from the Pleistocene fossil record. The Cherokee oral tradition includes references to creatures called the Uktena, a category of powerful spiritual beings typically depicted as serpentine, but with characteristics that some researchers have read as potentially incorporating memory of large Pleistocene fauna. The Shawnee traditions include accounts of an enormous beast that inhabited underground waters, sometimes called the underground panther or the underwater lion, whose description incorporates features that correspond better to some large Pleistocene mammals than to any living species. These parallels are not proof of anything definitive. Oral traditions accumulate and transform over centuries, incorporating new elements and dropping old ones, and the relationship between specific oral tradition content and specific historical events is always a matter of careful interpretation rather than simple equation. But the repeated appearance of very large underground animals in the oral traditions of peoples connected to the Mammoth Cave region, combined with the fossil evidence of very large animals having actually occupied the cave system during the Pleistocene, is a pattern that responsible researchers have documented and considered. What it suggests, at minimum, is that the relationship between human beings and Mammoth Cave is older than the 3,000 to 4,000 year archaeological record currently confirmed. If Paleo-Indian peoples, the first human inhabitants of the Americas, were present in the Kentucky region at or shortly after the end of the Pleistocene 12,000 years ago, which multiple lines of archaeological evidence from sites across Kentucky and the surrounding region suggest they were, then those peoples may have encountered the cave, may have observed the large animals using it, may have developed relationships with it and oral traditions about it that persisted across the enormous gap of time separating Paleo-Indian occupation from the Archaic period mining record that survives in the archaeological collections. 12,000 years of oral tradition is at the outer edge of what ethnographers and archaeologists have been willing to seriously entertain, but it is not beyond what other research has established as possible. The work of Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed, published in 2015 in the Journal of the Royal Society of Western Australia, demonstrated through systematic analysis that Aboriginal Australian oral traditions accurately describe geographical changes caused by sea level rise after the end of the last ice age, with those changes having occurred between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. The accuracy of geographic detail in these traditions, verified by comparison with coastal geomorphology, established that oral tradition can preserve specific landscape information across timeframes that should make any serious researcher cautious about dismissing native accounts as simply too old to contain reliable information. The warnings associated with Mammoth Cave were not simply supernatural prohibition. They were, among other things, a technology of caution developed by peoples with deep familiarity with a space that was genuinely dangerous, genuinely complex, and genuinely not fully understood even by those who knew it best. They preserved information across generations in the only medium available to non-literate cultures. They encoded practical knowledge in cosmological language, because cosmological language is memorable, transmissible, and resistant to the kind of casual modification that purely practical instructions tend to accumulate over time. And some of what they preserved was this: the cave goes further than you have gone. There are things inside it that are not like the things on the surface. Be careful. Both of those things were true, are true, And scientists who finally began to apply modern survey and analytical technologies to the cave's deeper reaches found confirmation in the rock and the sediment of what the oral traditions had been carrying all along. The application of ground-penetrating radar technology to Mammoth Cave's geological surroundings began in the 1990s and accelerated significantly in the 21st century as both the technology and the collaborative research frameworks evolved. Ground-penetrating radar sends electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measures the reflections produced by boundaries between materials of different densities. It can detect voids, passage systems, sediment layers, and geological structures without requiring physical access to the features being surveyed. When applied to the landscape above and surrounding Mammoth Cave, it has repeatedly revealed passage systems and void spaces that extend beyond the currently mapped boundaries of the cave, in directions and at depths consistent with the hydrological models suggesting the cave is larger than currently confirmed. More recently, muon tomography, a technique borrowed from particle physics that uses naturally occurring cosmic ray muons to image subsurface density variations, has been proposed and in limited applications piloted as a means of mapping deep cave passage systems from the surface. Muons are subatomic particles produced when cosmic rays strike the upper atmosphere, and they are penetrating enough to pass through hundreds of feet of rock. Variations in muon flux at a surface detector can be used to reconstruct a three-dimensional image of the density structure of the rock above and below, revealing large voids such as cave passages at depths inaccessible to conventional ground-penetrating radar. The application of this technology to the Mammoth Cave Plateau is ongoing at the time of writing, with preliminary results suggesting passage systems at depths between 200 and 400 feet that do not correspond to any currently mapped section of the cave. What lies in those unmapped passages, if the surveys are accurately identifying real voids, is not known. What the oral traditions of the nations associated with this landscape said about the deep interior of the cave, the sections no human being had traveled, should perhaps inform how researchers approach whatever they find. The passage from oral warning to scientific verification in the Mammoth Cave story did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened gradually, as a series of researchers, some working within formal institutional frameworks, and some working at the margins of those frameworks, began to treat the documented native traditions as sources of potentially accurate information rather than as cultural background noise to be noted and set aside. The process was uneven, sometimes contested, and remains incomplete, but it produced results, and those results have changed the questions being asked about the cave, about its deep history, and about what the peoples who spent generations in its passages knew that modern science is only beginning to verify. The specific question of what the elders were warning about when they described something waiting in the cave's deeper passages is one that no scientific survey has yet definitively answered, because no scientific survey has yet penetrated to the full extent of the system. The cave is larger than any current exploration program has fully documented. Its deepest reaches are inaccessible to all but the most technically capable cave divers and expedition climbers. The passages beyond the currently mapped boundaries suggested by the geophysical surveys have not yet been physically entered by any person equipped with modern analytical tools. What the prehistoric miners found when they went deep, what prompted the sustained intensive use of chambers miles from safety, what the communities above understood about those chambers through the traditions passed down by the people who went inside and came back out, carrying gypsum and torch ash, and presumably knowledge. These questions remain partly open, but the shape of the story has changed in ways that matter. It used to be told this way. Primitive prehistoric peoples occasionally entered the cave to collect useful minerals. They did not go very far. They did not understand what they were doing. The cave was later discovered by modern explorers who mapped and named its features and determined their extent. The indigenous peoples had no particular significance beyond being the first people to stumble across a geological curiosity. That story is not the story that the evidence tells. The story the evidence tells is this. For at least 4,000 years, possibly significantly longer, Communities living on the surface of the Mammoth Cave Plateau maintained organized, purposeful, sustained relationships with the cave's interior, navigating it in complete darkness, using engineered light sources, extracting specific materials from specific locations for reasons that included, but were not limited to, utilitarian extraction, depositing objects in locations and configurations consistent with intentional ritual practice, and preserving and transmitting knowledge about the cave's character through oral traditions that remained accurate enough to communicate real information about the cave's extent and nature across enormous spans of time. When those oral traditions said the cave went further than human beings had traveled, they were correct. When they said something waited in the deeper passages whose nature was different from the things of the surface world, they were describing a space that modern science has not yet fully entered, a space whose biological, geological, and archaeological character is likely to continue producing findings that revise our understanding of what has happened in this part of North America. Mammoth Cave is not a place that was discovered by Europeans and subsequently studied. It is a place that was known for millennia, used and respected and warned about across generations, that was then appropriated, partially explored by the forced labor of enslaved people whose names are largely absent from the standard account, commercially exploited, and eventually subjected to the kind of systematic scientific investigation that confirmed, one finding at a time, that the knowledge transmitted through the oral traditions of native nations was not mythology. It was memory, accurate memory, preserved across thousands of years in the only medium available. What happens now with that recognition depends on choices being made by institutions, researchers, descendant communities, and the wider public about how we understand the relationship between scientific investigation and the forms of knowledge that predate and in some ways exceed it. There are native elders alive today whose nations maintained historical connections to this landscape. Their knowledge is not identical to the knowledge of the people who carried torches into the dark 3,000 years ago. History has intervened in ways that disrupted, diminished, and in some cases entirely severed the specific transmission chains of specific traditions. But the framework, the understanding of the cave as a place with its own nature and its own relationships to the human communities around it, that has not disappeared entirely. And the institutions responsible for managing and studying Mammoth Cave have increasingly, if still inadequately, recognized that incorporating that framework into the research program produces better questions and sometimes better answers than excluding it. The better answers are still coming. The cave is still being explored. The surveys are still revealing new passages. The sediment in the deeper chambers has not yet been systematically analyzed for the organic materials that might reveal the presence of human activity deeper and older than what is currently confirmed. The hydrological connections between the mapped cave and the surrounding water table are still being traced. The acoustic properties of the deep chambers have not been fully documented or compared against the distributions of prehistoric material. The biological surveys of the cave's deep ecosystem, which includes dozens of species found nowhere else on Earth, are ongoing and are producing discoveries about the cave's biology that have implications for understanding its geological history as well. And in several of the cave's passages, there are features that have been noted in survey records, features that do not have obvious explanations in terms of purely natural processes, that have been filed away pending the resources and the research frameworks to properly examine them. Some of those features correspond, in their locations and their character, to descriptions in the oral traditions. The tradition said the cave had no end. The surveys keep finding more cave. The tradition said what waited in the deeper sections was not the same as what was found near the entrance. The biology of the deep cave, shaped by millions of years of isolation from the surface world, has produced an ecosystem unlike anything above ground. The tradition said those who went deepest brought back knowledge the surface world needed. The scientists who have gone deepest in this cave, who have crawled through water-filled passages and climbed through vertical shafts and navigated miles of unmapped corridor in complete darkness, consistently report that the experience changes how they understand the world, not because the cave is mystical in any way that contradicts their scientific training, because it is genuinely vast, genuinely ancient, genuinely complex, and genuinely not yet understood, which is exactly what the people who went in first, carrying torches braided from plant fiber and gourds for the mineral they came to find, were trying to say. The warnings were accurate, the cave has no end, and there is something waiting, though it is not what anyone who heard those warnings imagined it might be. It is stranger than that. It is the oldest continuously dark ecosystem on the continent, harboring life forms that evolved in isolation over geological timescales, in passages still being mapped, in water whose chemistry tells a story about this landscape's past that is still being deciphered. And somewhere in those deep passages, in sediment that has not been disturbed since whatever human hand last touched it, there may be evidence of who went deepest and what they brought back with them, and why the knowledge was worth the dark. The cave is waiting to tell that story. Scientists are finally learning to listen the way the elders said to listen. Carefully, with respect, without assuming you already know what you are going to find. Because everyone who assumed that about Mammoth Cave has eventually been wrong. The geological context of the Mammoth Cave system, the specific chemistry and structure that made it possible for human beings to spend extended time in the cave's deep interior, is worth understanding in detail because it explains why the cave became the kind of place that generated oral traditions, rather than simply being used and forgotten. The cave's dry passages, which constitute the majority of the archaeological record because moisture-damaged passages tend not to preserve organic materials, owe their dryness to a geological history of drainage change. The water that carved the cave moved through it and then moved away as the land surface above was gradually lowered by erosion and the water table fell correspondingly. Passages that were once flowing stream channels became dry after the water that filled them found lower exits. The result was a multi-level system in which upper, older passages are generally dry and lower. Younger passages still carry active water flow. The prehistoric users of the cave concentrated their activity overwhelmingly in the dry upper levels, which is consistent with both practical necessity and the oral tradition accounts of avoiding the flooded lower sections. But the relationship between the dry upper levels and the active lower levels is not static. Rainfall events on the surface translate into water level changes in the cave within hours. The cave's drainage network is directly connected to the surface hydrology of the plateau above, and during significant rain events, passages that are ordinarily navigable can become flooded with little warning. The limestone that forms the cave walls contains numerous small fissures and drains through which surface water descends rapidly, and the cave's internal drainage channels can carry those pulses of water far into the system before they drain out through the springs that discharge into the Green River. Anyone spending extended time in the deep cave needed to understand this hydrology. They needed to know when rain was falling on the surface above and what that would do to the water levels in the passages they were using. This required monitoring surface conditions while working underground, either by maintaining surface observers who could signal down through the cave's entrance, or by developing an internal knowledge of the cave's drainage behavior that allowed experienced guides to read the current conditions and make predictions. The oral traditions associated with the cave include references to specific conditions that signaled when the cave was safe to enter and when it was not. The language of these references, transmitted as they were through generations of translation and transcription, is not always clear enough to extract precise practical meaning, but the underlying function is recognizable. The knowledge of when to go in and when to stay out was part of the body of practical information that the cave relationship required and that the oral tradition carried. Modern cave management at Mammoth Cave National Park includes a detailed monitoring system for water levels in the cave's passages, and the park's visitor management protocols restrict access to certain sections during and after significant rainfall events. The practical logic is identical to what the ancient visitors were navigating, though the monitoring technology is obviously different. A cave that is accessible and safe in dry conditions can become genuinely dangerous in wet conditions within hours. The people who spent generations using this cave learned that lesson, encoded it, and passed it along. The encoding of practical cave use knowledge in oral tradition was, in fact, one of the more sophisticated information management achievements of the archaic period cultures of the eastern woodlands. Managing a resource extraction operation in an environment as complex and dangerous as a deep cave system, over timescales of centuries, without written records, required the development of knowledge transmission methods that were both accurate and durable. The oral traditions that carried warnings about the cave's character were not separate from the practical knowledge base that made cave use possible. They were the same thing expressed in a single integrated framework. The cosmological language that described the cave as alive, as inhabited by presences that demanded respect, was the framework that organized everything else. The specific practical knowledge, which passages were safe, when to enter, how to navigate in the dark, what signs indicated danger, what the minerals they sought looked like and where they were concentrated, was embedded in that framework in ways that made it memorable and transmissible across generations. The loss of that framework, as the communities that developed and maintained it were disrupted by disease, displacement, and the systematic destruction of indigenous cultural institutions in the 18th and 19th centuries, was a genuine knowledge catastrophe, not simply for indigenous cultural heritage in the abstract sense, but for the practical understanding of the cave itself. When Euro-American explorers began seriously investigating Mammoth Cave in the early 19th century, they were entering a space about which a comprehensive body of knowledge had existed and been transmitted for thousands of years, and they had essentially no access to any of it. They brought geological training and surveying tools and the physical courage required to crawl through tight passages in the dark, but they did not bring the 4,000 years of accumulated observational intelligence that the people who had used the cave before them had developed about its character. The result was a century and a half of exploration that was bolder and in some respects more dramatic than what the prehistoric users had done, but that was also repeatedly surprised by things that an informed tradition would have already known. The bottomless pit, which halted multiple early exploration parties until Stephen Bishop bridged it, was not bottomless. It was a feature whose character was navigable with appropriate knowledge. The flooding of lower passages that trapped multiple 20th century exploration teams was not unpredictable. It followed patterns that any sustained observational tradition would have documented. The connections between apparently separate cave systems that were discovered as dramatic breakthroughs in the 1960s and 1970s were not surprising in the context of an oral tradition that said the cave had no end. They were confirmations. The scientific exploration of Mammoth Cave, as practiced from the early 19th century through the late 20th century, was in significant part a process of rediscovering, by slower and more expensive methods, things that had already been known and then lost. This is not an argument against scientific methodology. It is an argument for taking indigenous knowledge seriously as a data source before conducting the scientific investigations that would confirm or refine it. The Mammoth Cave National Park, established in 1941, has evolved significantly in its relationship with descendant communities of the peoples who used the cave. The early park management reflected the assumptions of its era, which treated the prehistoric archaeological record primarily as a scientific resource to be managed by federal institutions with minimal engagement with the communities whose ancestors created it. The objects in the archaeological collections were treated as property of the United States government, accessible to researchers with the right credentials, not particularly accessible to the communities whose relationship with them was more direct than any credentialed researcher could claim. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 changed the legal framework significantly, requiring federal agencies and institutions receiving federal funding to identify and potentially return human remains and culturally significant objects to affiliated tribes. The application of that law to the Mammoth Cave collections has been an ongoing process, complicated by the difficulty of establishing specific tribal affiliation for materials that are thousands of years old and that predate the historical periods for which documentary evidence of tribal continuity exists. But the process has forced a different kind of engagement between the park management and the descendant communities than had existed previously. and that engagement has begun to produce collaborative research frameworks that treat native oral traditions and perspectives as informative rather than merely decorative. The results, in terms of the quality of the research questions being asked about the cave's ancient history, have been meaningful. Questions that were not previously being asked, or that were being asked in ways that excluded relevant information, have been reformulated. The question of why the prehistoric users went to such extraordinary lengths to obtain gypsum, for example, has been productively reimagined in the context of what oral traditions from descendant communities say about the significance of minerals obtained from underground spaces. The question of which chambers were used and which were avoided has been productively approached by asking what oral traditions describe about the internal differentiation of significant underground spaces. The question of what the torch drop sites in passages not associated with mineral extraction indicate has been productively explored through the lens of traditions describing offerings and depositional practice in underground contexts. None of these reframings has produced simple answers. The relationship between a specific oral tradition and a specific archaeological feature several thousand years old is never a simple correspondence. But the reframings have produced better hypotheses, more useful research designs, and a more complete account of what the archaeological evidence is actually describing. The cave does not keep all of its secrets in the places that have already been explored. This is a fact that any serious student of Mammoth Cave's history has to sit with. The cave is larger than currently mapped. Its boundaries are uncertain. The geophysical surveys suggesting major undiscovered passage systems have not been physically investigated in many cases. The deeper biological and geological record of the cave is still being worked out. The sediment in chambers that were intensively used by prehistoric people in ways we do not fully understand has not been fully analyzed. And then there is the deeper question that the oral traditions were pointing at, in the vocabulary available to peoples who understood the world through cosmological frameworks rather than geological ones. What is the nature of the thing that the cave connects to? For the cultures that used Mammoth Cave over thousands of years, that question had a specific answer embedded in their cosmological frameworks. The underground was not simply geological space. It was one of several layers of reality, connected to the surface but operating by different rules, inhabited by powers that were neither malevolent nor benevolent in any simple human sense, but that were real and significant and required to be engaged with appropriately. The cave was a place of power not because it was supernatural, but because it was real in ways that the surface world was not fully equipped to reckon with. The darkness, the silence, the pressure of miles of rock above your head, the way sounds moved in ways they did not move on the surface, the presence of animals that lived without ever seeing light, the minerals that crystallized in forms that had no equivalent in the surface world, all of these things were evidence of a reality that required a cosmological framework adequate to contain it. Modern science has a different vocabulary for the same recognition. The deep cave ecosystem at Mammoth Cave, the community of organisms that live and have lived in the cave's passages for millions of years without access to sunlight, is one of the most scientifically extraordinary biological assemblages in North America. Over 400 species have been documented in Mammoth Cave, including more than 100 species found nowhere else on Earth. The cave's fish, the northern cavefish and the southern cavefish, are species whose populations have been isolated in underground streams for so long that they have lost their eyes and their skin pigmentation entirely, evolving sensory systems adapted to complete darkness. The cave cricket, which ranges between the cave's interior and the surface above, represents one of the key links in the cave's food chain, carrying nutrients from the surface world into the dark on its body and in its waste. Cave-adapted crayfish, isopods, amphipods, mites, springtails, and millipedes represent millions of years of evolutionary adaptation to an environment that most life cannot survive. The cave's biological communities are adapted to a world that is genuinely different from the surface world. Not metaphorically different, physically different, operating under different rules of energy and information and time. The organisms in the deepest passages of Mammoth Cave have been isolated from the surface world for geological timescales. Their evolution has been driven by forces that have no surface equivalent. Their sensory systems perceive a reality that no surface organism can access. They are, in a meaningful biological sense, inhabitants of a different world that happens to exist beneath ours. The elder traditions that said there were things in the deeper passages that were not like the things of the surface were describing something real, not what they thought they were describing, because the cosmological vocabulary available to them organized that reality in ways that modern biology does not. But the underlying observation that the deep cave was inhabited by things whose nature was genuinely different from the things of the surface was accurate. The eyeless fish in the lightless streams of Mammoth Cave's lower passages are real. They are there. They have been there for longer than human beings have been in North America. They are genuinely different from anything on the surface in ways that go beyond appearance. And they are in passages that the prehistoric users of the cave may have encountered on the fringes of their explorations. Whether the ancient visitors to Mammoth Cave ever penetrated deeply enough to encounter the cave's fully isolated biological communities is a question that cannot be answered with current evidence. The distribution of prehistoric material in the cave's passages suggests the mining activity concentrated in upper passages at distances from the entrance that are substantial but not extreme. The deeper, lower passages, where the cave's aquatic ecosystem is most developed, are flooded and not accessible without dive equipment. It is possible that the prehistoric users of the cave were aware of these lower passages, had observed or heard things emerging from them, had developed traditions about their inhabitants without ever physically entering them. The sounds that multiple oral traditions reference, sounds heard in the dark that had no visible source, may have included the sounds of underground water movement, which, in limestone cave systems, can travel remarkable distances through the rock and emerge in dry passages far from their source, as apparently sourceless murmurs and rumbles. They may have included the sounds of the cave's biological community. Cave crickets, in particular, produce sounds that are audible to human ears, and that in enclosed passages can be disorienting in terms of apparent direction and distance. They may have included the sounds of the cave's own geological activity, the slow movement of water through limestone fissures, the occasional small rockfall from a passage ceiling, the very subtle sounds of a vast geological system in the slow process of enlarging itself one dissolved grain of calcium carbonate at a time. All of these things were real. All of them were genuinely different from anything experienced on the surface above. All of them required a framework for interpretation, and the cosmological frameworks of the cultures that used this place for thousands of years provided such a framework. That framework said, among other things, pay attention, be careful. This place is not what you think it is. It goes further than you know. Treat it accordingly. Modern science has arrived at the same conclusion through a different route. The application of modern isotopic analysis to the cave's sediment and geological formations has produced a record of the cave's environmental history that extends back millions of years and that contains, embedded in the chemistry of the speleothems, the cave's mineral deposits, a detailed record of surface climate conditions that the cave's environmental stability preserved, while the surface itself changed dramatically. Speleothems grow slowly, incorporating atmospheric and hydrological signals into their structure as they form, and their chemical composition can be analyzed to reconstruct past temperature, precipitation, and vegetation patterns with resolution that complements and sometimes exceeds what can be obtained from other paleoclimate proxy records. The speleothem record from Mammoth Cave is one of the most detailed paleoclimate archives in North America east of the Mississippi, and it has been used to reconstruct surface environmental conditions going back through the last several glacial-interglacial cycles, hundreds of thousands of years of climate history preserved in the cave's mineral deposits. That record shows, among other things, that the region experienced dramatic climate variability during the period of intensive prehistoric cave use, with significant drought episodes interspersed with periods of greater moisture, and that the cave itself remained a stable, predictable environment, even as the surface above it went through conditions that would have severely stressed human communities dependent on surface resources. This is one of the more interesting hypotheses that has emerged from the integration of paleoclimate data with the archaeological evidence from the cave. The intensive use of Mammoth Cave during the Archaic period, whatever its cosmological dimensions, also provided practical access to a stable microenvironment at a time when surface conditions were variable and potentially threatening. The cave maintained its temperature and humidity regardless of what was happening above. The water emerging from the cave's springs was reliable even during surface drought. The animals that the cave's biological community supported, the cave crickets in particular, were available as food during periods when surface resources might be reduced. The cave was not only a source of mineral wealth, it was a buffer against surface environmental instability. A place whose predictability, in a world of unpredictable surface conditions, had practical survival value that would have been understood and valued by any community with the knowledge to access it. The oral traditions that described the cave as a place of power, as a connection to a reliable reality beneath the unstable surface, may have been encoding, in cosmological language, a very concrete observation about the cave's practical utility as an environmental refuge. The things that made the cave powerful in cosmological terms, its stability, its predictability, its connection to underground water and underground resources, were also the things that made it practically valuable in ways that might literally have sustained communities through surface environmental crises. This integration of the cosmological and the practical is characteristic of indigenous knowledge systems more broadly, and is part of why treating those systems as merely symbolic, rather than as containing real information, has consistently led researchers to underestimate them. The oral traditions about Mammoth Cave were not a collection of metaphors about spiritual experience. They were an integrated knowledge system that used cosmological language to organize practical information about a real place in ways that made that information memorable, transmissible, and actionable across multiple generations. The information those traditions were transmitting was accurate. The cave goes further than you have gone. It maintains conditions unlike the surface. Its deeper sections are inhabited by things unlike anything on the surface. Engage with it carefully and with respect for its character. Those propositions have been confirmed by scientific investigation conducted millennia after the traditions were formed. What has not yet been confirmed, but because the investigation has not yet reached the relevant depths, is what the tradition suggested waited at the limit of human penetration. The oral accounts are not specific enough, and the documentary record of them is not complete enough to construct a precise expectation. But the general direction of the claims, toward a vast, deep, old, complex system containing realities genuinely unlike anything on the surface, is a direction that the science has consistently validated. The cave is not finished. Its deepest history has not been read. The peoples who knew it best left warnings that turned out to be accurate. The scientists who are going deepest now are finding, in the rock and the sediment and the biology and the chemistry of the passages no human has entered in recorded history, confirmation that the thing they were warned about is real. It is just not the kind of real any of them expected. The Mammoth Cave system as a whole represents something genuinely unique in the North American archaeological and geological record. No other cave system on this continent has a comparable combination of physical extent, preservation quality, prehistoric archaeological richness, oral tradition depth, and ongoing scientific discovery potential. The cave has been studied since the early 19th century and is still, in the early 21st century, being discovered. That combination of qualities, long known and still unknown, thoroughly studied and still yielding revelations, is unusual enough that it demands an accounting of what kind of knowledge the cave has been, is being, and will be capable of producing. The prehistory of the cave, the story of who went inside and when and why and what they knew and what they brought back, is the story that matters most to the questions this document has been examining. But it is not separable from the geology, the biology, the climate history, the colonial history, and the contemporary management story. The cave is a single thing, encountered differently by different observers in different historical moments, but continuous through all of those encounters in ways that make it possible, if you read the different accounts in relation to each other, to reconstruct something like the full story. The full story begins before human beings arrived in North America. It begins with limestone deposited in a shallow tropical sea 330 million years ago, with water moving through that limestone over geological time and carving passages of extraordinary scale. With the development of an isolated ecosystem in those passages over millions of years, during which the surface world above went through the entire arc of mammalian evolution. By the time the first human beings arrived in North America, crossing from Siberia across Beringia, or traveling along the Pacific coast or both, Mammoth Cave was already ancient in a sense that dwarfs any human timescale. The cave's ecosystem had already been isolated for millions of years. The cave's passages were already carved to something close to their present form. The cave's biological communities had already evolved the extreme adaptations to permanent darkness that make them so scientifically extraordinary today. Into that ancient system came human beings, first probably as Paleo-Indian hunters following megafauna herds across the landscape at the end of the last glacial maximum, then as the Archaic period communities whose archaeological record inside the cave is the most directly documented portion of the story, then as the Woodland and Mississippian period, cultures whose relationship to the cave is less archaeologically specific, but whose oral traditions constitute the main body of the warning literature, then as the Euro-American colonizers, whose engagement with the cave produced the commercially driven early exploration and the forced labor of enslaved guides, then as the scientific community of the 20th and 21st centuries, whose work is still ongoing, and alongside all of them, continuously, the descendant communities of the native nations whose relationship with this landscape is the longest in human history. Each of these groups brought a different set of tools for understanding what they were encountering. Each understood a different portion of the truth about what the cave was. None of them, including the contemporary scientific community, has understood all of it. The recognition that this is the case, that Mammoth Cave exceeds the capacity of any single investigative tradition to fully account for, is perhaps the most important intellectual position that researchers can adopt when approaching it. The cave is too large, too old, too complex, and too varied in what it has meant to different human communities to be contained by any single framework. The prehistoric miners who brought torches and gourds 3 miles into absolute darkness were not accessing the same cave that the 19th century cave guide Stephen Bishop mapped by the light of a lamp. Bishop was not accessing the same cave that the Cave Research Foundation expedition mapped using modern survey instruments in the 1970s. Contemporary researchers using ground-penetrating radar and muon tomography are accessing a different version again. Each of these encounters revealed something real, and each of them missed something that other encounters had access to. The oral traditions of native nations connected to this landscape had access to something that none of the scientific approaches, early or contemporary, has fully recovered. They had access to 4,000 years or more of sustained observational attention, embedded in a knowledge system designed specifically to preserve and transmit practical and interpretive information about this place across long timescales. That access was not lost entirely when the historical disruptions of the 18th and 19th centuries damaged and dispersed the communities that held it. But it was reduced, and recovering what remains of it, in collaborative research frameworks that treat indigenous knowledge holders as partners rather than as informants to be queried and then set aside, is one of the most valuable things that can be done in the study of this cave's history. Because the warnings were accurate, and if the warnings about the extent and character of the cave were accurate, it is worth asking what else the knowledge system that generated those warnings preserved. What other information about the cave's nature and history is embedded in the oral traditions and ceremonial knowledge of the nations who maintained relationships with it? What questions a researcher informed by that knowledge would think to ask that a researcher without it would not? Those questions are being asked now, in some research programs, by some researchers, in some institutional contexts, not uniformly, not as fast as the cave's known history demands, not with the resources that the cave's scientific significance should attract, but being asked. The cave is answering, slowly, as caves answer, in rock and sediment and biology and chemistry and the echo of sounds in chambers where the darkness is old enough to have a weight. The elders were not wrong. Scientists have looked. The looking is not done. And somewhere in the unmapped passages, in the sections of the cave that no human being in recorded history has entered, in the darkness that has been continuous since before any person thought to warn about it, the thing the traditions described is still there. Not a spirit, not a supernatural entity in any way that science can measure, but a reality that is genuinely unlike the surface world, genuinely old, genuinely complex, and genuinely not yet understood. The people who went in first, carrying their braided torches and their gourd containers into the absolute dark, knew that. They told everyone who came after them. They told us, across 4,000 years of careful transmission, the only way they could. In warnings that turned out to be the most accurate scientific description of Mammoth Cave that has yet been produced. The cave has no end. Something waits at the deeper end of things. Be careful how you enter. That knowledge, passed from person to person across more generations than can easily be counted, through every disruption and catastrophe that history imposed on the communities who held it, survived long enough for the science to catch up, and the science confirmed it. That is the story of Mammoth Cave, not the story of who discovered it, or who mapped it, or who owns it. The story of what it is, and how long it took the people who arrived latest to believe what the people who were there first had been trying to tell them. The darkness was real. The extent was real. The things inside it were real. The warnings were accurate. And the cave, patient in the way that only geological things can be patient, waited for someone to listen. The story of the cave's biological communities and what they tell us about the deep history of North America is, in some respects, the most scientifically revolutionary aspect of the entire Mammoth Cave narrative, and it is the aspect that connects most directly to what the elder traditions were preserving. When evolutionary biologists began systematically studying the cave's fauna in the early 20th century, they found something that required a significant rethinking of how isolated ecosystems develop. The cave's biota, the community of organisms living in the cave's passages and aquatic systems, is not a simple subset of the surface biota with a few species modified by cave life. It is a distinct community with its own internal structure, its own food web, its own ecological dynamics, and dozens of species found nowhere else on Earth. The evolutionary history embedded in this community stretches back not merely thousands but millions of years, and it tells a story about the history of the region's surface landscape that cannot be read from the surface record alone. The northern cavefish, Amblyopsis spelaea, is one of the cave's most studied inhabitants. It is completely blind, having lost functional eyes through evolutionary regression over the course of its isolation in underground waters. Its skin contains no functional pigment, making it pale and somewhat translucent. Its lateral line system, the sensory organ that detects water movement and pressure variations in the surrounding environment, is highly elaborated compared to surface fish species, providing it with sensory information about its environment in the absence of visual input. It is, in the most literal biological sense, an organism that evolved to inhabit permanent darkness. Its ancestors were almost certainly surface fish that entered the cave's aquatic system at some point in geological history and became isolated there, eventually evolving these extreme adaptations to the cave environment over millions of years. The time frame implied by the degree of evolutionary divergence between the cavefish and its closest surface relatives is the detail that connects most directly to the elder traditions. When molecular phylogeneticists analyzed the genetic distance between Amblyopsis spelaea and its surface-dwelling relatives, the results suggested that the cave lineage had been isolated from surface fish populations for somewhere between 5 and 12 million years, depending on the molecular clock calibration used. 5 to 12 million years of isolation in the cave's underground water system. This means that the cavefish lineage was already ancient, already millions of years into its underground existence, when the first human beings arrived in North America. The cave's biological community is not a recent accident. It is a biological archive of extraordinary age, preserving within its genetic makeup information about the evolutionary history of the region that predates every significant geological event in North America's recent past. This is the context in which the elder tradition's reference to things in the deeper passages that were not like the things of the surface becomes most precisely accurate. The cavefish, the cave crickets, the cave-adapted crayfish and isopods and amphipods in the cave's aquatic system are genuinely not like the things of the surface. They are real, they are in the cave, and their difference from surface organisms is not superficial. It is the product of millions of years of evolutionary divergence in an environment that human beings cannot inhabit without technology. The deep passages of Mammoth Cave contain organisms whose entire evolutionary history has occurred in complete darkness. Organisms that perceive and inhabit a world whose sensory parameters have no equivalent on the surface. Organisms that are genuinely alien to the surface world, even though they are, in the taxonomic sense, related to surface organisms. The people who went into the cave 3 and 4 miles from the entrance, by torchlight, to mine gypsum from the walls, were not going into an empty space. They were going into a functioning ecosystem with its own dynamics and its own inhabitants. Whether they were aware of the cave's full biological community in any systematic way is not documented. Whether they encountered the cave's aquatic fauna in the stream passages of the deeper system, or observed cave crickets moving along passage walls, or heard sounds that the cave's biological community generated and interpreted those sounds through the cosmological framework available to them, is not known. But the possibility that sustained human presence in the cave's interior over centuries produced observational knowledge of the cave's biological community, which was then encoded in the oral tradition's descriptions of things in the deeper passages that were different from things on the surface, is not implausible. The encoding would not have been taxonomic in any modern sense. The traditions were not trying to describe Amblyopsis spelea in terms that would satisfy a biologist. They were trying to convey the experience of encountering things in the dark that behaved differently from anything on the surface, that moved differently, that seemed to perceive differently, that occupied the darkness in a way that no surface organism did. The vocabulary available for that description was cosmological, not biological, but the underlying observation that the cave was inhabited by things whose nature was genuinely different from surface things was accurate. And the accuracy of that observation is one of the reasons that researchers who take the elder traditions seriously and who read them carefully in light of what modern science has confirmed about the cave find them so significant, not because the traditions predicted what science would discover in any literal sense. The traditions did not describe eyeless fish in terms that would have been recognized as describing eyeless fish, but they preserved the observation, the recognition that the deep cave was inhabited by things whose nature deserved acknowledgement, and they transmitted that observation accurately enough across thousands of years of oral tradition that when scientists finally looked, the observation turned out to be verifiable. The observation was not wrong. It was ahead of the investigative capacity of anyone who heard it, until the investigative capacity finally caught up. The biological surveys of Mammoth Cave have not stopped finding new species. The cave's microbial community, the community of bacteria and archaea inhabiting the cave's surfaces, sediments, and waters, has received increasing scientific attention in recent decades as the tools for characterizing microbial diversity have improved. The results have been consistently surprising. The cave harbors microbial communities with unusual metabolic capabilities, including organisms that derive energy from chemical reactions involving minerals in the cave's walls and sediment, rather than from organic matter produced on the surface. These chemolithotrophic organisms, organisms that eat rock chemistry, are not unique to Mammoth Cave, but their presence in the cave is part of a picture of the deep cave ecosystem as energetically self-sustaining in ways that do not depend on inputs from the surface. A cave that can sustain life without sunlight, without organic matter from the surface, is a cave that is operating by genuinely different rules than the surface world. The energy that drives the cave's deepest biological communities comes from the chemical potential energy stored in the rock itself, released by slow reactions between the rock's mineral constituents and the water moving through the system. This is, in a very real sense, a world that runs on different energy than the surface. A world that would continue to function and to sustain its biological communities, regardless of what happened above it. The cave's deep biological communities are not dependent on the surface world in the way that most surface ecosystems are dependent on sunlight. They have their own independent energy source, older and more reliable than anything the surface offers. The elder tradition's framing of the underground as a distinct world, one that operated by different rules and that was not simply a continuation of the surface world by other means, is consistent with this biological and chemical reality. The underground is a distinct world. It operates by different rules. Its inhabitants are not simply modified versions of surface organisms. They are organisms that evolved to inhabit a space with no sunlight, no seasons, no wind, no surface temperature variation, but with its own energy sources, its own dynamics, its own temporal rhythms measured not in days and years, but in the slow geological time of mineral dissolution and crystal growth. The people who framed the underground as a distinct world were, in the framework available to them, describing something real. Modern researchers who have spent extended time in Mammoth Cave's deep interior, far from any entrance and far from any human-made light source, report an experience that is difficult to fully convey to people who have not had it. The darkness is complete in a way that produces its own phenomenological effects. The silence is not complete, because the cave has its own sounds, water and air movement, and the slow geological activity of a living limestone system, but it is a silence unlike any experienced on the surface. The sense of the rock as present, as surrounding, as genuinely massive in a way that normal surface experience does not prepare you for, is physically overwhelming in a way that many researchers describe as transformative. This is not mysticism. This is physiology. The human nervous system evolved on a surface where light was constant, where spatial orientation was provided by visual input, where sound had predictable directionality, where the thermal environment was within the range of comfortable homeostasis without extreme physiological demand. In the deep cave, all of those assumptions fail. The nervous system has to adapt to an environment for which it was not specifically designed, and that adaptation process produces experiences that have no surface equivalent. The visual cortex, deprived of input, generates its own imagery. The auditory system, without the background noise that normally provides a baseline, becomes extraordinarily sensitive to small sounds. The proprioceptive system, deprived of visual confirmation, becomes more dependent on touch and pressure. The overall effect is an altered experience of being in space and time that is not quite like anything a person who has not been in deep cave darkness can fully imagine. The people who entered Mammoth Cave with torches 3,000 years ago were experiencing a version of this. The torchlight they carried was adequate for immediate navigation, but did not illuminate more than a few tens of feet in any direction. The darkness beyond their torchlight was complete and surrounded them continuously. The sounds they heard, the cave's biological activity, the movement of air through passages, the drip of water in chambers where the cave's hydrology was active, had no surface equivalent and required interpretation within whatever framework they had developed for making sense of the deep cave. That framework was cosmological. The cave was alive. It breathed. It had presences. The darkness was populated by things that had to be acknowledged. This framework was not simply a projection of surface cultural categories onto an unfamiliar environment. It was a response to a genuine phenomenological reality, the reality of being in a space whose characteristics had no surface parallel, whose biology was genuinely alien to surface experience, whose sounds and movements and temperatures required interpretation, and whose sheer scale and age were beyond anything that surface landscapes could convey. The cosmological vocabulary was the most accurate vocabulary available for describing an experience that exceeded the capacity of ordinary descriptive language to contain. Modern researchers who have spent the most time in the cave's deep interior tend to speak about it in ways that are, quietly, not entirely different. They describe the cave as having a character, as being a particular kind of place in a way that geological features usually are not described. They describe the experience of the deep cave as one that changes how you think about the relationship between the surface world and the world below it. They describe the cave's biological community with a kind of reverence that goes slightly beyond the standard scientific register, not because they are adopting a cosmological framework in any explicit sense, but because the reality of the deep cave exceeds the purely descriptive capacity of any framework designed primarily for surface observation. The elder traditions that the warnings came from were trying to convey exactly this. The cave is real in a way that the surface is not fully equipped to comprehend. It goes further than you know. What lives inside it is genuinely different. Approach it accordingly. The science has confirmed the factual content of those claims. The phenomenological content, the recognition that this place exceeds ordinary frameworks for understanding, has been independently rediscovered by every researcher who has spent serious time in its deep interior. The tradition and the science are, on these points, in agreement. Not because science is confirming superstition, but because both are responding to the same underlying reality, a reality that is genuinely extraordinary and that has been waiting to be understood for as long as any human being has been in North America. The question of what the prehistoric users of Mammoth Cave knew that we are still working to recover is, finally, a question about the nature of knowledge itself. How is knowledge produced? How is it preserved? What kinds of knowledge are best transmitted through oral tradition versus written records versus physical artifacts versus scientific instruments? What is the relationship between knowledge embedded in cosmological frameworks and knowledge embedded in empirical frameworks? Can these different kinds of knowledge speak to each other? Should they? The Mammoth Cave story suggests they can and should. The oral traditions preserved accurate information about the cave's nature and extent that scientific investigation has confirmed. The scientific investigation has revealed details about the cave's biology, geology, and climate history that illuminate and contextualize what the oral traditions were trying to convey. Neither body of knowledge is complete without the other. Together, they produce something closer to a full account of what this place is and what the history of human engagement with it has been. That fuller account, still being assembled by researchers working in frameworks that increasingly take both bodies of knowledge seriously, is one of the most significant intellectual developments in the study of pre-Columbian North America in the contemporary period. It is significant not because Mammoth Cave is unique, though its scale makes it exceptional. It is significant because the methodological shift it represents, from treating indigenous knowledge as background noise to treating it as potentially accurate information, has implications for how we study every site, every landscape, every historical question in which native knowledge traditions have something to say. The elders warned about what was beneath Mammoth Cave. They were right. Scientists finally looked. What they found was not what the elders' vocabulary described, but it was real, and it was what the elders were pointing at, translated across 4,000 years and two very different systems for understanding the world. That translation is the most important thing to understand about the story of Mammoth Cave. The cave itself is astonishing. 400 miles and still not fully mapped. Biology millions of years old adapted to permanent darkness. A climate record of the continent's history preserved in limestone and mineral deposits. A prehistoric mining operation of extraordinary sophistication conducted in complete darkness by people who understood this place better than any current researcher does. A body of oral tradition that carried accurate information about the cave's nature across thousands of years of transmission through every disruption and catastrophe that North American history imposed on the communities that held it. But the most important thing, the thing that matters most for how we study the past and how we understand the relationship between different kinds of knowledge, is that the warnings were accurate, and that recognizing their accuracy required finally being willing to take them seriously. That took too long. The taking seriously is not yet complete, but it has begun. And the cave, 400 million years old and counting, 400 miles mapped and still not done, has the patience to wait for us to finish. The darkness inside Mammoth Cave, 4 miles from the entrance, in a passage where no human being has stood in recorded history, is the same darkness that the ancient miners moved through by torchlight 3,000 years ago. It is the same darkness that the oral traditions were warning about. It is the same darkness that the scientists have been pushing back, year by year, expedition by expedition, discovery by discovery, since they first began to understand how large and how old and how complex this place truly is. The darkness is not a metaphor. It is a physical reality. It is the medium in which the cave's history has been preserved and in which its deepest secrets are still held. And the scientists who go deepest, who crawl through the passages that no one has entered before, who turn off their lights and sit in the complete dark and listen, report that the cave sounds like nothing else in the world, that the darkness has a weight, that the passage beyond the reach of their torchlight seems, in some way that exceeds their ability to explain, to contain something that has been waiting to be found. That something is real. The elders knew it was there. The science is catching up. The cave is waiting. Go carefully. There is no end to it. And what waits in the deeper passages is older and stranger and more real than any of us have yet been able to hold in a single account. That is the truth about what is beneath Mammoth Cave. It has been known for a very long time. It is still being discovered, and it is worth every mile of darkness required to approach it. To understand why the elder warnings about Mammoth Cave persisted with such specificity across so many generations, you have to understand the structure of the communities that transmitted them, and what it meant for a piece of knowledge to survive in those communities for centuries and then millennia. Pre-Columbian communities in the eastern woodlands of North America were not illiterate in any sense that diminished their capacity to preserve information. They were oral societies, which is a fundamentally different thing, and the distinction matters enormously for how we interpret the knowledge they transmitted. An oral society does not simply speak its knowledge aloud and hope for the best. An oral society develops sophisticated, tested, multi-layered systems for preserving knowledge that is considered important, systems that encode information in forms resistant to the kinds of corruption and degradation that affect casually spoken language. These systems include song, ceremony, narrative, spatial practice, and the organizational embedding of knowledge in social structures specifically designed to ensure its continuity. The knowledge about Mammoth Cave that was transmitted through oral tradition was not casual knowledge. It was knowledge about a significant place, a place whose significance was multiple and layered. It was a source of materials that had ritual importance. It was a threshold to an underground world that occupied a specific and significant position in the cosmological framework of the cultures that used it. It was a place that had killed people and that could kill more people if approached, without the knowledge required to navigate it safely. It was a place that had ecological significance, connected to the water system of the Green River Valley in ways that affected the productivity of the landscape above it. It was a place with a history of human use and engagement that extended back further than any individual could remember, and that was, therefore, carried in the collective memory of the community rather than in any individual's lifetime of experience. Knowledge of this character, in oral societies that understood the preservation of such knowledge as a social responsibility, was not left to casual transmission. It was structured. It was embedded in forms that made it memorable and that resisted arbitrary modification. The specific vehicle for this embedding varied between different cultural traditions. In some traditions, the knowledge was embedded in ceremony, in ritual sequences that required participants to master specific content in a specific order as a condition of their participation. In others, it was embedded in narrative, in stories with specific structures and specific details whose exact reproduction was monitored by knowledgeable listeners who would correct deviations from the established form. In others, it was embedded in song, in musical structures that carried specific content in forms that were resistant to modification because the musical form imposed constraints on what words could be substituted without disrupting the song. The warnings about Mammoth Cave were transmitted through these kinds of structures, not as casual folklore subject to individual elaboration, but as part of the organized knowledge system of communities that understood their relationship with the cave as a serious responsibility requiring serious management. When those communities were disrupted by the epidemics that preceded Euro-American colonization and by the political and military displacements that accompanied it, the transmission chains of specific knowledge were damaged in specific ways. Some chains broke entirely. Others were preserved but degraded, losing precision as the context that had originally structured and supported them disappeared. Others survived more intact, in communities that maintained greater continuity of social organization through the colonial period. The documentary record of the warnings about Mammoth Cave represents the degraded edge of a knowledge system whose full extent and precision is no longer recoverable. The surveyor account from the Filson Historical Society, the Cherokee oral tradition references collected by late 19th century ethnographers, the Shawnee accounts recorded by early travelers in Kentucky, these are fragments of a much larger body of knowledge, preserved by the accidents of which collectors happen to be in which places, at which moments, and translated through which linguistic and cultural frameworks. They do not represent the full knowledge that indigenous communities once held about this cave. They represent what survived the systematic dismantling of the knowledge systems that held that knowledge. This is an important point because it means that the accuracy of the warnings we can document is not evidence of the full accuracy of the full warning tradition. What survived to be documented was already a selection, already filtered, already translated. The full tradition, before colonization, almost certainly contained more specific, more precise, more detailed information about the cave's character, extent, and significance than the fragmentary documentation that survives. When the documented fragments are already accurate enough to be confirmed by modern science, the implication is that the full tradition, had it survived intact, would have been even more precisely useful for guiding scientific investigation. The loss is not only cultural, it is scientific. The disruption of indigenous knowledge traditions about North American landscapes has deprived researchers of information that would have accelerated and deepened their understanding of those landscapes. The recognition of this loss has come slowly and unevenly to the scientific community, and it continues to be resisted in some quarters by researchers who remain committed to a model of knowledge production in which indigenous traditions are raw material for scientific analysis rather than forms of knowledge with their own validity and their own contributions to make. But the evidence from case after case, of which Mammoth Cave is one of the most compelling, makes the case for a different model increasingly difficult to resist. What did the elders know about the cave that science is still discovering? The question is not fully answerable, because the full body of elder knowledge is not recoverable. But the partial answer, available from the fragments that survive, is already remarkable. They knew the cave was larger than anyone had yet traveled into it. Science has confirmed the cave is the longest known cave system on Earth, and surveys continue to suggest it is larger than currently mapped. They knew the cave's deeper sections were inhabited by things whose nature was different from anything on the surface. Science has confirmed the cave contains hundreds of species found nowhere else, including organisms that evolved in millions of years of darkness and that are genuinely alien to surface experience. They knew the cave was a threshold to a different world, operating by different rules. Science has confirmed the cave's deep ecosystem is energetically self-sustaining through chemolithotrophy, genuinely independent of surface energy inputs, a world running on different energy than the surface world. They knew the cave had a character that required engagement with respect rather than casual exploitation. The history of the cave's management, from the early commercial tourism through the establishment of the national park through the contemporary collaborative research programs, suggests that this is correct in ways that go beyond cultural protocol. They knew the cave had significance for the health and stability of the landscape above it. The cave's hydrological connections to the Green River system, its role in the regional groundwater dynamics, and its significance as a refuge and breeding ground for species that range between the surface and underground environments, all support a model of the cave as genuinely significant for the ecological health of the region it underlies. These are not trivial correspondences between oral tradition content and scientific finding. They are correspondences at the level of the most fundamental claims the oral tradition was making, not details about specific mineral deposits or specific passage geometries. Fundamental claims about the cave's nature, extent, inhabitedness, and significance. And those fundamental claims have been confirmed, one, by scientific investigation that was conducted without any primary reference to the oral traditions and that arrived at the same conclusions through independent empirical means. The convergence is not coincidental. It is the result of two different knowledge-producing traditions, separated by centuries of colonial disruption and disciplinary distance, both attempting to understand the same real thing. When they finally compare notes, as researchers working in collaborative frameworks are beginning to do, the convergence reveals that both traditions were tracking reality and that the overlapping portions of what they found deserve special credence precisely because they were found independently. The portions that do not yet overlap, the portions where the oral tradition makes claims that science has not yet confirmed or denied, are the most interesting to consider. Because if the parts of the tradition that have been tested have turned out to be accurate, the default assumption about the parts that have not yet been tested should shift, not to uncritical acceptance, but to genuine investigation rather than dismissal. The tradition says there is something in the deeper passages. Science has not yet fully penetrated the deeper passages. The appropriate response, given the tradition's track record of accuracy on testable claims, is to go deeper and look. That is what the current generation of researchers is doing. With modern survey technology, with muon tomography and ground-penetrating radar and stable isotope analysis, and environmental DNA sampling of the cave's waters, with collaborative research frameworks that include indigenous knowledge holders in the design of research questions rather than simply in the collection of cultural background information, with a slowly growing recognition that the boundary between what science can investigate and what it has historically chosen to investigate is itself a form of knowledge production, not a natural limit, and that moving that boundary toward the questions that indigenous traditions have been pointing at for centuries is a legitimate and productive direction for scientific inquiry. The cave rewards investigation. Every time the boundary of known passage has been extended, every time a new section has been entered, every time a new analytical method has been applied to existing collections or to sediment samples from the cave's deep interior, the cave has produced findings that changed what the researchers thought they knew. The cave does not run out of surprises. It is too large, too old, too complex, and too consequential to be exhausted by any current or foreseeable research program. The investment in understanding it more completely is an investment in understanding North American history, ecology, climate, and the epistemology of knowledge production in ways that extend far beyond the specific findings about this specific cave. But this particular cave, this specific enormous dark system beneath the Kentucky hills, is also worth caring about for its own sake, not as a resource, not as a subject of study, not as a heritage site to be managed for visitor access, as a place, as an extraordinarily ancient, extraordinarily complex, extraordinarily significant place that has been in relationship with human beings for longer than recorded history can account for, and that has its own history, its own inhabitants, its own integrity, its own right to be understood rather than simply exploited. The elder traditions that warned about this place understood it as a place with its own nature, a place that demanded acknowledgement of its character, a place that had been there before human beings arrived and that would be there after they were gone. That understanding is not inconsistent with scientific inquiry. It is, in fact, the foundation of the best scientific inquiry, the recognition that what you are studying is real in ways that exceed your current understanding, that it existed before you arrived and will exist after you leave, and that the most honest posture toward it is curiosity combined with humility. The cave predates human presence in North America by hundreds of millions of years. The specific passages and chambers that exist today were carved over millions of years by water working on limestone. The biological communities in the cave's deep interior evolved over millions of years in complete darkness. The climate record preserved in the cave's mineral deposits extends back through multiple glacial cycles. Human beings, including the prehistoric miners and the contemporary scientists, are very recent participants in this cave's history, and the history that preceded them is genuinely not yet fully understood. The elder traditions that warned about the cave were trying to convey this, not in the vocabulary of geology or paleoclimatology or evolutionary biology, in the vocabulary available to them, which was a vocabulary of powers and presences and relationships, of worlds within worlds and thresholds between them and the protocols required for crossing those thresholds appropriately. That vocabulary is not the vocabulary of modern science. But the reality it was pointing at is the same reality that modern science is investigating, and the accuracy of the pointing, tested against what science has confirmed, is sufficient to take seriously what has not yet been tested. The cave has no end. That was the first and most fundamental thing the tradition said. The cave goes further than any person has yet traveled into it. Go carefully. There are things inside it that you were not prepared for by anything you know from the surface. Be respectful. This place was here before you arrived, and will be here after you are gone. Come back. The knowledge you find here belongs to more than just you. It belongs to the communities that sent you, and the communities that will come after you. Those were the instructions, transmitted across 4,000 years, confirmed by science, still being confirmed, still being acted on. The cave is waiting for whoever comes next, carrying whatever light they have, prepared or unprepared for what the dark will teach them. The darkness is accurate. It does not lie. It does not simplify or comfort or make things easier than they are. It shows you exactly what is there when you bring enough light to see it. And it reminds you, in every moment of every mile traveled through it, that the light you carry is very small and the dark is very large, and the cave extends further than you know. The elders knew this. They told us. We are just now, finally, beginning to understand what they meant. The Mammoth Cave limestone is soluble in mildly acidic water and has been dissolving for 330 million years. It will continue dissolving for as long as water moves through it. The passages that exist today will continue to enlarge. New passages will form. The cave is not a fixed system. It is a process, a slow geological process that has been operating continuously since before any complex life existed on land. The cave will be here when human civilization, in whatever form it takes, is old enough to have its own ancient history. It will be here when the languages currently spoken above it have changed beyond recognition. It will be here when the species that are now endangered by surface conditions have either found a way to persist or have gone the way of the megafauna whose bones lie in its sediment. The elder traditions, in treating the cave as a presence rather than simply a feature, were intuitively grasping something that geological science confirms. The cave is not a static object. It is a dynamic process, alive in the geological sense, changing in ways that operate on timescales that exceed human comprehension but that are real and consequential. The cave's character will be different in 10,000 years than it is today. In 10 million years, the surface above it will have eroded further. Some passages will have been exposed to the surface, others will have collapsed, and the system will look different in its large-scale geometry, while continuing the same fundamental process of water dissolving limestone in a darkness that has been continuous for geological epochs. Human beings are, in this context, an extremely recent and extremely brief phenomenon. The elder traditions that placed human beings in relationship with the cave, rather than treating the cave as a human resource, were expressing an accurate recognition of the relative scales involved. The cave does not need human beings. It was here before any mammal existed. It will be here after any human civilization has run its course. The human engagement with it, the mining and the warnings and the commercial tourism and the scientific surveys, is a very thin layer of very recent activity in a history that is almost incomprehensibly longer. This does not make the human engagement insignificant. The elder traditions were not arguing that the cave's age made human connection to it irrelevant. They were arguing the opposite, that the cave's age and character and extent and inhabitedness made human engagement with it consequential in ways that demanded seriousness and care. The recognition of one's own smallness in relation to something genuinely vast and ancient is not a reason for passivity. It is a reason for attention, for humility that does not collapse into disengagement, but instead sharpens the focus of the engagement that does occur. The scientists who have spent the most time in Mammoth Cave's deep interior report experiencing exactly this. The cave is humbling in the most literal sense. It makes you small, not in a way that destroys the value of your investigation or your presence, in a way that clarifies it. You are a small, brief, light-carrying creature in a space that is very large and very old and very dark, and what you can understand of it with the light you carry is real and important, and the darkness beyond your light is also real and important, and the relationship between what you know and what you do not know is the most important thing you can attend to when you are in the cave. The elders were expressing the same thing in different language. They were saying, be aware of the ratio between what you know and what you do not know. The cave is larger than your knowledge of it. The things inside it are older than your frameworks for understanding them. Approach accordingly. Modern science has not yet developed a fully adequate framework for the ratio the cave presents. The mapped portion is 400 miles. The unmapped portion is unknown by definition, but the evidence suggests it is substantial. The biological knowledge of the cave is extensive but not complete. The geological and paleoclimate record the cave contains is partially read but not fully understood. The archaeological record of human use is documented but not fully analyzed. The oral knowledge traditions that carried information about the cave across thousands of years are fragmentary and partially recovered. None of these knowledge domains is closed. All of them are still in active development. This is, to state the obvious, an extraordinary situation for a cave that has been visited by Euro-American travelers since the early 19th century and that has been a national park since 1941. Mammoth Cave is one of the most visited natural heritage sites in North America, receiving hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, and it is simultaneously one of the most scientifically underexplored systems of comparable significance on the continent. The gap between its public profile and its scientific frontier is a reflection of exactly the kind of assumption the elder traditions were warning against. The assumption that what is known is essentially what there is to know. The assumption that a familiar place is a fully understood place. Mammoth Cave is not a fully understood place. It is an extremely well-visited place with an extremely imperfectly understood interior. The visitors who walk the historic tours are seeing an extraordinary system, but they are seeing a very small portion of it, in conditions designed for their safety and comfort, in passages whose character has been studied intensively for 2 centuries and is still not fully accounted for. The cave that lies beyond the visitor trails, the cave that extends through the unmapped passages suggested by geophysical surveys and hydrological analysis, the cave that the prehistoric miners navigated by torchlight 3 miles from the entrance, the cave that the elder traditions described as having no end, is still out there, still dark, still waiting. The warnings were accurate. The science has confirmed it. The looking is not done. And the darkness, patient and honest and genuinely vast, will be there for whoever comes next with enough humility to take seriously what the people who came first were trying to tell them. 4,000 years of warnings. 400 miles of confirmed passage. An ecosystem millions of years old in the dark. A climate record extending through ice ages and warm periods and everything in between. A biological community unlike anything on the surface of this continent. And beyond all of that, beyond the mapped portions, beyond the studied sections, beyond the passages that any human being has entered in any era, whatever the elder traditions were pointing at when they said the cave had no end and that something waited at the deeper end of things, science has confirmed the cave has no end. Science has confirmed something waits in the deeper passages. What that something fully is remains to be discovered. The cave is waiting. The darkness is honest. The warnings were true. Go carefully when you enter. The dark is very old and very large, and it will teach you things that nothing on the surface can teach you about the nature of the world you live on. That is what the elders knew. That is what the science is confirming. That is what Mammoth Cave has been trying to say. In the language of limestone and darkness and the fossils of creatures that have been gone for 12,000 years, and the eyeless fish that have never seen light, and the gypsum crystals growing on the walls in formations that no human technology has ever equaled, and the braided torches left in passages 3 miles from the entrance 3,000 years ago by people who understood what they were entering in a way that the people who came after them are still working to recover. The story of Mammoth Cave is the story of the longest known cave in the world. It is the story of the people who went inside it first, and what they knew about it, and what they tried to tell everyone who came after. It is the story of what was lost when the communities that held that knowledge were disrupted, and what fragments survived, and what those fragments, tested against scientific investigation, turned out to contain. It is the story of the science that is still being done, still finding new passages and new species and new climate records, and new evidence of prehistoric human activity in places that no one expected to find it. And it is the story of what is still unknown, still unlit, still waiting in the dark beyond the furthest point any human being has yet traveled into this extraordinary system beneath the Kentucky hills. The elders warned about it for 1,000 years. Scientists finally looked. What they found was exactly what the warning said was there, and more than any framework they brought with them was prepared to account for. That is Mammoth Cave. That is the truth beneath the hills. That is what the darkness holds. It is still holding it. The looking is not done. The cave is patient. The warnings were accurate. And the darkness at the end of the furthest passage is the same darkness the first person to carry a torch 3 miles into the earth was staring into, trying to understand, and came back to tell the others about. They were right about what they found. They were right about what they could not reach. They passed that knowledge forward across every generation that followed. And now the science is following where the warnings pointed, into the dark, looking for what waits at the end of the longest cave in the world. It is there. Whatever it is. In the oldest dark in North America, in the passages that no map yet shows, in the system that the elder tradition said had no end. They were right. The cave has no end. Go carefully. The darkness is honest, and there is so much of it left. The history of American archaeology in the 19th and early 20th centuries is, in significant part, a history of the systematic erasure of the depth and sophistication of pre-Columbian North American cultures. The assumptions that drove that erasure were not primarily scientific, though they were dressed in scientific language. They were cultural and political assumptions about the nature of the peoples who had occupied North America before European colonization, assumptions that served specific ideological purposes and that were embedded so deeply in the institutional practices of archaeology and anthropology that they shaped what questions were asked, what evidence was preserved, what interpretations were published, and what findings were incorporated into the standard account of North American prehistory. The application of those assumptions to Mammoth Cave produced a specific and consequential distortion of the archaeological record. The earliest investigators of the cave's prehistoric deposits, working in the first half of the 19th century, were not trained archaeologists in any modern sense. They were curious travelers, commercial operators, and occasional natural historians who removed objects from the cave's passages with varying degrees of care and attention to context. The objects they removed were often documented well enough to establish their existence and their approximate provenance within the cave. But the sediment context that would have enabled more precise spatial and stratigraphic analysis was largely destroyed in the process of their removal, and the interpretive framework applied to those objects reflected the assumptions of their era about what pre-Columbian North American peoples were and were not capable of. The assumption that shaped early interpretation most powerfully was the assumption of simplicity. Pre-Columbian North American cultures, in the 19th century Euro-American view, were simple. They were primitive. They were engaged in essentially unchanged subsistence practices that represented an early stage of human development, a stage that European civilization had long since surpassed, and that the progression of history was in the process of eliminating. Evidence that complicated this picture, evidence of organized trade networks spanning hundreds of miles, of engineering achievements requiring sustained collective effort, of cosmological sophistication reflected in burial practices and ritual material culture, was consistently interpreted in ways that minimized its implications. The people were simple. The things they made and did must therefore have been simple, whatever the evidence appeared to show. Mammoth Cave complicated this picture severely, and the complication was managed by minimizing it. The prehistoric mining of gypsum deep in the cave's interior was not a simple activity. It required knowledge of the cave's geography, which could only have been developed through sustained engagement over time. It required navigation technology, the engineered torches, and the knowledge of how to use them effectively in a complex underground environment. It required understanding of the hydrological dynamics of the cave, which passages were safe at which times under which conditions. It required social organization capable of coordinating and supplying mining expeditions that lasted, by the evidence of the torch stubs, multiple hours in the deep interior. It required the motivation of a cultural system that valued gypsum highly enough to justify all of this investment. And it produced results. The gypsum that appears in ritual contexts at surface sites across the region that were incorporated into a wider social and cosmological economy of considerable sophistication. The 19th and early 20th century interpretation of this evidence was that it represented simple people, probably without complex social organization, who occasionally wandered into the cave to collect a mineral that happened to be useful, and whose ability to navigate the dark interior was remarkable but probably not as systematic or organized as it appeared. The evidence was there. The interpretation minimized it to fit the assumption of simplicity. The 20th century gradually, unevenly, and still incompletely corrected this interpretation. The development of radiocarbon dating in the late 1940s and its application to cave archaeological materials beginning in the 1950s established the antiquity of the prehistoric cave use with precision that was not previously available. The systematic application of modern archaeological methods to the cave's deposits, beginning with the work of Patty Jo Watson and her colleagues from the 1960s onward, produced a far more detailed and rigorous picture of the prehistoric activity than anything the 19th century had achieved. Watson's work in particular, which combined excavation of preserved deposits in the cave's passages with analysis of the material recovered, and collaboration with experimental archaeologists who reconstructed the technologies involved, established the prehistoric use of Mammoth Cave as one of the most important examples of organized, purposeful, sophisticated pre-Columbian activity in the eastern woodlands. Watson's work also took the oral tradition evidence seriously in ways that earlier investigators had not. She did not treat the indigenous knowledge about the cave as simply a cultural supplement to the archaeological evidence. She treated it as information that might be relevant to interpreting the archaeological evidence, and she pursued that relevance in her analyses of the material from the cave's passages. Her approach was not uncritical. She applied the same standards of evidence to claims derived from oral tradition as to claims derived from material analysis, and she was clear about the limits of what could be concluded from fragmentary traditional knowledge filtered through imperfect documentary records. But she took the knowledge seriously as knowledge, and her work is better for it. The tradition she was working within, of taking indigenous knowledge seriously as a potential source of information about the archaeological record, has grown significantly since Watson's foundational contributions in the 1960s and 1970s. It is not yet the dominant tradition in American archaeology. The field remains substantially structured by assumptions and institutional practices that treat indigenous knowledge as supplementary rather than as epistemically co-equal with empirical evidence. But the case for a different approach has been building for decades, and Mammoth Cave, with its extraordinary combination of archaeological evidence and oral tradition depth, is one of the strongest cases for it that exists in the North American record. The case rests not on sentiment or cultural politics, though both are relevant to the question of how indigenous communities should be treated in the management and study of sites that their ancestors created. It rests on the empirical record of what the oral traditions have turned out to contain. The traditions said the cave was vast, and it is. The traditions said the deeper portions were inhabited by things unlike anything on the surface, and they are. The tradition said approaching the cave without appropriate knowledge was dangerous, and it was and is. The tradition said the cave required ongoing relationship rather than one-time exploitation, and the evidence suggests this is true in multiple senses: ecological, archaeological, and epistemological. These are not small correspondences. They are correspondences at the level of the most important things the traditions were trying to convey, and they have been confirmed by scientific investigation that was conducted independently of the traditions and that arrived at the same conclusions through different means. That record of confirmation is the epistemic basis for taking seriously the portions of the traditions that have not yet been tested, not as certainty, but as leads worth following. The tradition has been right about the things that can be checked. It deserves consideration for the things that cannot yet be checked. That consideration should take the form of designing research programs that would allow the untested claims to be evaluated, rather than dismissing them as unscientific and therefore irrelevant. This is, gradually and incompletely, what is happening. The collaborative research frameworks that have developed between researchers at Mammoth Cave National Park, archaeologists, and cave scientists from multiple universities, and representatives of descendant communities of the nations historically connected to the cave, represent a genuine methodological development that could not have been described or predicted by the research paradigms that dominated American archaeology in the early and mid-20th century. These frameworks are not without tension. They involve negotiating between epistemological commitments that are genuinely different, between knowledge systems that have different standards of evidence and different understandings of what counts as explanation and what counts as significance. But they are producing research questions and research findings that neither tradition alone would have produced. And that is a meaningful indicator that the collaboration is adding something real. The most productive questions emerging from these collaborative frameworks tend to be questions about function and meaning, rather than simply about chronology and material composition. Not just when were these objects placed in the cave and what are they made of, which are the questions that purely empirical archaeological methods are best equipped to answer. But why were they placed where they were placed? What did the cave mean to the communities that used it? How did the knowledge about the cave's character get integrated into the broader knowledge system of those communities? And what can the material record, read in light of the oral tradition, tell us about the cognitive and cosmological frameworks that organize the behavior we see in the archaeological evidence? These are harder questions. They require more interpretive work, more willingness to operate in conditions of uncertainty, more engagement with frameworks that are not reducible to empirical verification. But they are also more important questions, because they get closer to what is actually significant about the prehistoric use of Mammoth Cave. The significance is not simply that people went into a cave and collected a mineral. The significance is that they did so within a comprehensive framework of understanding about the cave's nature and their relationship to it, that they transmitted that framework across generations with enough accuracy to preserve real information about the cave's character, and that the framework they developed produced knowledge that has proved accurate when tested against modern scientific investigation. That is a significant intellectual and organizational achievement, and it deserves recognition as such. The recognition of that achievement is part of what the current generation of researchers studying Mammoth Cave is working toward. Not as a sentimental tribute to the past, but as a contribution to the ongoing project of understanding what the cave is and what it means and how best to approach it. The elder knowledge is not merely historical, it is a resource for current and future research. The frameworks embedded in the oral traditions that survived, fragmentary as they are, contain perspectives on the cave's character that are not easily reproducible by any research program that does not take those frameworks as a starting point. They offer a way of seeing the cave that has been tested over thousands of years of engagement with it, and that testing has produced results that the much briefer history of scientific investigation is still catching up to. The argument is not that indigenous knowledge is infallible or that it should be accepted without critical evaluation. The argument is that it has demonstrated sufficient accuracy on testable claims to earn serious consideration rather than dismissal, and that the mechanisms by which it was developed and transmitted, specifically a sustained, organized, multi-generational program of engagement with a specific place, are mechanisms that have produced real knowledge about that place. Knowledge that was preserved, tested by experience, corrected when it proved inaccurate, refined across generations of use, and transmitted in forms designed for durability. That is not a casual knowledge production process. It is a rigorous one, operating by different methods than modern science, but toward the same end of accurate understanding of real phenomena. The phenomena in this case are the phenomena of Mammoth Cave, a geological system of extraordinary extent and complexity, a biological community of extraordinary age and distinctiveness, a climate archive of extraordinary duration and resolution, a prehistoric archaeological record of extraordinary richness and sophistication, and a set of oral traditions developed over thousands of years of engaged relationship with the cave that have proved accurate in their fundamental claims about the cave's nature. All of these things are real. All of them are significant. All of them are still being studied. None of them is fully understood. The elder traditions pointed at the cave and said, "Pay attention. This place is larger and older and more complex and more significant than you know. What you find here when you go deep enough is not what you were prepared for by anything you know from the surface." They were right. The science is confirming it. One discovery at a time. One expedition at a time, one analysis of one batch of sediment from one unmapped passage at a time. Mammoth Cave is the longest cave system on Earth. It is one of the most biologically diverse cave systems ever studied. It contains one of the most detailed paleoclimate records in eastern North America. It holds one of the richest prehistoric archaeological records of any underground site in the Americas. And it is the subject of one of the most sustained and specific bodies of indigenous oral tradition about an underground place in the record of North American cultural history. That combination is not coincidental. The cave attracted the attention and the engagement of the peoples who lived near it for good reasons, reasons that are accessible both through the oral traditions they transmitted and through the scientific investigation that has confirmed those traditions' most fundamental claims. The cave was worth paying attention to. It repaid sustained attention with real knowledge. The people who paid that attention over thousands of years were not primitive or superstitious or confused about the nature of what they were engaging with. They were knowledgeable, sophisticated, organized, and accurate in their fundamental assessments of the cave's character. The warnings they transmitted are the evidence of that knowledge. The accuracy of those warnings, confirmed by science, is the evidence that the knowledge was real, and the portions of that knowledge that have not yet been tested are the frontier where the next discoveries will be made by researchers willing to take seriously what was preserved and transmitted across 4,000 years of careful attention to one of the most extraordinary places in North America. The cave is waiting. The warnings are clear. The darkness is honest. What waits in the deeper passages is real and significant and not yet fully known. Go carefully. The elders were right. The scientists are learning. The cave is not finished with any of us. The archaic period cultures of the Green River Valley, the people who spent centuries in organized, sustained relationship with Mammoth Cave's interior, were part of a much wider cultural world than the cave use alone would suggest. The eastern woodlands of North America, in the period between roughly 4,000 and 1,000 years ago, was not a patchwork of isolated communities, eking out simple subsistence existences in disconnected territories. It was a complex, interconnected world of communities engaged in long-distance exchange, shared ceremonial practices, sophisticated knowledge management, and social organization capable of producing the kind of coordinated collective effort that the cave's prehistoric use required. The evidence for this wider world is distributed across the archaeological record of the eastern woodlands in ways that allow researchers to reconstruct a picture of pre-Columbian North American cultural complexity that is, in most important respects, more sophisticated than the image presented in standard school curricula and popular treatments of the subject. The Hopewell phenomenon, named for a site in Ohio where a particularly rich concentration of the relevant material was first identified, represents a network of cultural exchange that operated across most of the eastern woodlands from roughly 2,000 to 1,500 years ago, connecting communities from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes and from the Atlantic seaboard to the Mississippi River Valley through a shared ceremonial economy whose material signature includes copper from Lake Superior, mica from the southern Appalachians, marine shells from Florida, obsidian from Wyoming, and freshwater pearls from rivers across a vast interior geography. This was not trade in the modern market sense. It was the movement of materials through social networks of exchange that were embedded in ceremonial relationships between communities, relationships that were maintained through periodic gatherings, through the exchange of gifts with specific cosmological significance, through shared ritual practices that provided a framework of shared meaning within which the exchange took place. The Hopewell Network was, in effect, a continental-scale religious and social institution that operated without central administrative authority, without writing, without the hierarchical state structures that European observers associated with civilization, and that nevertheless managed to maintain coherent cultural practices and material connections across an enormous geographic territory for centuries. The communities that used Mammoth Cave during the Archaic period predated the height of the Hopewell phenomenon, but they were part of the cultural lineage that produced it. The Green River Archaic communities were engaged in the same basic patterns of exchange and social organization at smaller scale and over shorter distances that the Hopewell phenomenon would bring to its continental maximum. The gypsum they mined from Mammoth Cave was one of the materials that moved through these networks. The cosmological frameworks that organized their use of the cave were part of the shared cultural vocabulary that Hopewell expanded and elaborated. The knowledge of the cave that they developed and transmitted was part of the broader knowledge system of a cultural world that was, by any honest assessment, sophisticated enough to have produced extraordinary things. Understanding the Mammoth Cave mining as part of this wider cultural world changes its significance. It is not a local curiosity, a particular adaptation to a particular geological feature. It is a window into a continental-scale cultural system whose complexity and sophistication are genuinely impressive, and whose relationship to the natural world was organized by frameworks of knowledge and meaning that produced real understanding of the places they engaged with. The cave was not just a source of a useful mineral, it was a node in a continental network of meaning-making, exchange, and knowledge production that connected communities across the eastern woodlands through shared frameworks of cosmological significance. The oral traditions that carried information about the cave across generations were part of the same network. They were transmitted not only within the local communities whose members actually went into the cave, but through the wider exchange networks that connected those communities to peoples across the region. This is part of why the warnings about Mammoth Cave appear in the traditions of multiple nations, including nations whose historical territories were not immediately adjacent to the cave. The knowledge was part of the shared cultural vocabulary of a wide world, transmitted through the same channels that transmitted information about sources of valued materials, about the locations of significant cosmological sites, about the appropriate protocols for engaging with places of power. The cave, in this context, was one of the most significant places in the eastern woodlands. Its significance was not primarily geological, though the geology was remarkable. Its significance was cosmological, practical, and epistemological. Cosmological because it was understood as a threshold to a different world. Practical because the materials it provided were significant in the ceremonial economy of the wider network. Epistemological because the knowledge of how to access and use it appropriately was itself a form of cultural capital, a kind of expertise that conferred status on the communities and individuals who possessed it, and that was preserved and transmitted with the care that any valuable intellectual resource deserves. The people who had the knowledge of the cave were people of consequence in the wider cultural world. The knowledge gave them access to materials that other communities valued. It gave them cosmological authority that translated into social influence. It gave them a relationship to the underworld that had meaning in the shared framework of Eastern Woodlands cosmology. The cave was not just a place. It was a resource of the first order, in every sense that the cultural system of the Eastern Woodlands recognized as significant. This is the context in which the warnings make the most sense. They were not just practical cautionary advice, though they were that. They were a codification of the knowledge that gave their transmitters their significance in a wider cultural world. To hold the knowledge of the cave was to hold something of extraordinary value. To transmit it accurately was a responsibility of the same order as the responsibility to accurately transmit the other forms of specialized knowledge that constituted the currency of the Eastern Woodlands ceremonial economy. The disruption of this cultural system by the epidemics and displacement that accompanied European colonization was not simply a human tragedy, though it was certainly that. It was an epistemological catastrophe. The knowledge networks that had developed and maintained information about the Eastern Woodlands landscape over thousands of years were damaged in ways that are not fully recoverable. The specific chains of transmission that had carried information about Mammoth Cave, about the cave's extent and character and significance, and appropriate protocols for engagement, were among the knowledge networks that were disrupted. Some transmission chains broke entirely, others were degraded to fragments. Only a few survived with enough integrity to carry information that could still be recognized as accurate when tested against modern scientific investigation. That any survived at all is a testament to the sophistication of the knowledge management systems that indigenous communities had developed, and to the determination of specific individuals and communities who maintained and transmitted what they could through the most devastating conditions imaginable. The fragments that survived the epidemics and the political violence and the forced cultural assimilation programs of the colonial and post-colonial periods are extraordinary, not because of their quantity, which is heartbreakingly small relative to what was lost, but because of their quality. What survived was selected by pressure for accuracy and resilience. The knowledge that turned out to be the most robustly maintained was the knowledge that was most deeply embedded in the most durable transmission structures, and that most deeply embedded knowledge tended to be the most fundamental, the most cosmologically significant, the most repeatedly reinforced through ceremony and practice. The warning that the cave was larger than any person had yet traveled into it was deeply embedded. It was a foundational claim about the cave's nature, the kind of claim that would have been reinforced every time someone returned from a mining expedition and reported on what they had found, the kind of claim whose accuracy was directly verifiable by anyone who entered the cave with sufficient determination. It was the kind of claim that would have been taught to every person who participated in the cave's use, repeated in the ceremonies that organized that use, embedded in the cosmological framework that gave the cave its significance. It survived because it was true and because it was essential to everything else that the cave meant. The warning that the deeper passages were inhabited by things unlike anything on the surface was also deeply embedded. It was a cosmological claim that organized the entire framework of how the cave was understood and approached, a claim whose functional truth, in the sense that the cave's deep ecology genuinely was unlike anything on the surface, would have been observable to anyone who spent enough time near the boundary between the well-traveled upper passages and the flooded lower system. Cave crickets move in ways that differ from surface insects. The sounds of underground water are unlike surface water sounds. The air movement in cave passages is unlike surface air movement. The darkness and what it reveals when a torch illuminates it is unlike anything on the surface. The fundamental observation that the cave's deeper character was different from the surface world was not an abstraction. It was an observation that anyone who had spent serious time in the cave would have made, and that would have required integration into whatever explanatory framework was available. The cosmological framework that organized Eastern Woodlands communities' understanding of the world provided that integration. These are the warnings that survived. And they are the warnings that science has confirmed. Not every detail of every tradition that referenced the cave. Not the specific vocabulary used in specific transmission chains that no longer exist. The fundamental claims. The cave is vast. The cave goes further than you know. What lives in the deep cave is not what lives on the surface. Approach with knowledge and with appropriate recognition of the cave's character. These fundamental claims have been confirmed. That confirmation matters not only for the historiography of Mammoth Cave, but for the epistemology of how we understand the relationship between different knowledge-producing traditions. It matters for how we approach other sites where indigenous oral traditions carry information about the archaeological and ecological record. It matters for how we design research programs that could benefit from the deep observational traditions that indigenous communities developed over long periods of sustained engagement with specific landscapes. It matters for how we understand the pre-Columbian history of North America, which was not a history of simple people living simple lives, but a history of sophisticated communities managing sophisticated relationships with complex landscapes over thousands of years. Mammoth Cave is one of the clearest examples in the North American record of the depth and accuracy of that management. The cave's prehistoric users built a relationship with it that lasted for millennia, produced real knowledge, and transmitted that knowledge accurately enough to remain informative 4,000 years later. That is a remarkable achievement by any standard, and it deserves recognition as such. It deserves recognition in the way Mammoth Cave National Park interprets its history to visitors. It deserves recognition in the research programs the park supports and collaborates in. It deserves recognition in the broader public understanding of pre-Columbian North American culture. And it deserves recognition in the scientific community's approach to the cave's ongoing investigation, which should take seriously the traditions that have proved accurate, and design investigations that could test the claims those traditions make that have not yet been evaluated. The cave is still there. The darkness is still honest. The warnings are still relevant. The elders were right about what was beneath Mammoth Cave. Scientists have finally looked, and they keep finding confirmation. The looking is not done, and the cave, patient and vast and genuinely extraordinary, will continue to teach anyone who enters it with sufficient humility to accept the lesson. What is beneath Mammoth Cave is the longest cave system in the world, still being mapped, still being discovered, with a biological community unlike anything on the surface, and a climate record that extends through ages of ice and warmth and ice again, and a prehistory of human engagement that stretches back 4,000 years in confirmed archaeological evidence, and potentially much further in the logic of the oral traditions that preserved information about it, with enough accuracy to be confirmed by modern science. That is what the elders warned about. That is what the scientists found. That is what the cave is. It is extraordinary. It deserves the humility it demands, and it is not done teaching us. The darkness inside Mammoth Cave at the boundary of the furthest mapped passage is the same darkness that the first person to carry a torch 3 miles into the earth encountered. The same darkness, the same black, the same silence that is not quite silence, because the cave breathes and the water moves, and the cave crickets call and the sound travels in ways that surface sound does not travel. The same stone, the same cold, the same smell of limestone and water and old dark. But the person carrying the torch today carries a different light, a light that can illuminate more of the wall in more detail, that can reveal the chemistry of the mineral deposits and the age of the sediment layers and the DNA of the organisms living in the water at their feet. A light that illuminates more than a torch of braided plant fiber could illuminate, but that is still very small in relation to the darkness that surrounds it. The cave is still larger than the light. The elder tradition said it was. Science has confirmed it, and in the darkness beyond the edge of the mapped system, in the passages that no human being has entered in any era, the cave continues. How far it continues is not yet known. What it contains is not yet fully documented. What its deepest biological communities look like, what its most ancient sediment records preserve, what the geophysical surveys are detecting in the passages they have identified but not yet physically investigated, all of this remains to be discovered. The warnings were accurate. The looking is not done. Go carefully. The cave has no end. And what waits in the deeper passages is real and significant and patient, and it has been waiting for a very long time for someone to arrive with enough light and enough humility to finally understand what they are seeing. The elders knew it was there. Scientists are finding it. The darkness is honest. The cave is waiting, and it is worth every mile of darkness required to approach the truth of what it holds. There is a particular quality to the knowledge that emerges from sustained, long-term engagement with a single place that is very difficult to replicate through any form of brief or occasional investigation. Modern scientific studies of Mammoth Cave have produced extraordinary findings, but those findings are the product of investigations that are measured against the timescale of the cave's history, extremely recent. The radiocarbon dating programs that established the antiquity of the prehistoric cave use began in the 1950s. The systematic archaeological surveys of the cave's passage deposits are largely products of the 1960s through 1990s. The biological surveys are ongoing but remain incomplete. The geophysical surveys suggesting unmapped passage systems beyond the current boundaries of the known cave are products of the 1990s and 2000s. The application of muon tomography to cave exploration, while proposed for Mammoth Cave, is still in its early stages there. All of this investigation has been productive and has transformed the understanding of the cave, but it represents decades of intermittent attention by different researchers with different instruments and different questions in a system that took 4,000 years of sustained, organized engagement to develop the kind of comprehensive understanding that the prehistoric mining programs represent. The people who went into the cave with torches 3 and 4 miles from the entrance were not occasional visitors. They were regular participants in an organized relationship with the cave that was maintained over centuries by communities with the institutional stability to sustain it. They knew where the gypsum deposits were located because they had been told by their predecessors who were told by their predecessors, in a chain of transmission that extended back far enough that no single living person could remember when the relationship had begun. They knew which passages were safe under which conditions because that knowledge had been tested and refined by generations of people whose experiences had been incorporated into the shared knowledge base of the communities involved. This is what institutional knowledge looks like when the institution is a community rather than a university or a government agency. It looks like oral tradition. It looks like ceremony. It looks like the kind of knowledge that is embedded in practice and transmitted through participation rather than through documentation and formal instruction, and it can accumulate and refine over timescales that no formal institution has yet existed long enough to match. The National Park Service has managed Mammoth Cave since 1941. That is 80 years, plus or minus, of institutional engagement with the cave. The prehistoric communities whose archaeological record is preserved in the cave's passages maintained organized relationships with it for at least 4,000 years, and potentially longer. The ratio between these two spans of institutional engagement is roughly 50-1. The Park Service, with all of its resources and personnel and research programs, has been engaging with the cave for 1/50th as long as the communities whose engagement it has largely replaced. And in those 80 years, the Park Service has confirmed, one discovery at a time, the fundamental claims that 4,000 years of prior engagement had preserved in oral tradition. This comparison is not a criticism of the Park Service, which has made genuine and significant contributions to the cave's scientific understanding. It is a reminder of the scale of the epistemological advantage that extended, sustained, organized engagement with a specific place provides over any program of shorter-term investigation. The prehistoric communities that use Mammoth Cave had an epistemological advantage over modern researchers that is measured in centuries. Whatever the formal tools of scientific investigation can achieve in decades, 4,000 years of sustained engagement can, in principle, achieve more. The question is, how much of that advantage survived the disruptions of colonization and how it can be accessed and integrated with modern scientific methods? The answer, based on what has been documented, is that enough survived to be informative. The fragments of the oral tradition that have been documented and that correspond to testable scientific claims have proved accurate. The framework within which those fragments are embedded, the cosmological understanding of the cave as a vast, inhabited, significant threshold to a different world, is a framework that produces accurate predictions when its key claims are empirically evaluated. The advantage that 4,000 years of engagement produced has not been entirely lost. It has been reduced and damaged and filtered through imperfect documentation and translation, but it has not been eliminated. What survives is worth taking seriously, and the research programs that take it seriously are producing better results than those that do not. The practical challenge is that taking indigenous knowledge seriously in the context of scientific research requires institutional changes that are not easily achieved. It requires building relationships of trust with descendant communities that take time and sustained effort to develop. It requires incorporating knowledge holders from those communities into research programs as genuine partners rather than as consultants who are queried and then set aside. It requires developing research designs that can evaluate claims from oral traditions alongside claims from material evidence without reducing one to the other or treating either as automatically superior. It requires managing the tension between the epistemological standards of academic disciplines and the epistemological frameworks of oral knowledge traditions in ways that are respectful to both without collapsing their genuine differences. And it requires the institutional patience to sustain these relationships and these research programs over timescales that are long by academic standards, even if they are short by the standards of the knowledge traditions being engaged. These are real challenges. They are being addressed imperfectly and unevenly in research programs associated with Mammoth Cave and with a growing number of other sites across North America, where the intersection of archaeological evidence and indigenous oral tradition is productive enough to justify the investment. The results, where the investment has been sustained, have been meaningful. The research questions are better, the interpretations are more complete, the findings are more significant. The collaboration adds value that neither tradition alone can produce. The cave rewards this kind of engagement. It always has. It rewarded the sustained engagement of the prehistoric communities whose organized relationship with it produced real knowledge, preserved accurately enough to remain informative 4,000 years later. It has rewarded the more recent scientific engagement that has confirmed and elaborated what the oral traditions preserved. It rewards the collaborative engagement that is now producing research programs that combine both bodies of knowledge. The cave is not indifferent to who approaches it and how. It is a real place with real character, and it responds to genuine attention by yielding genuine understanding. This is what the elder traditions were saying when they described the cave as alive, as a presence, as a place that required appropriate acknowledgement and careful engagement. Not that the cave had consciousness in any way that modern biology would recognize, but that it had character, that it was real in ways that demanded engagement with that reality, rather than with projections of what observers expected or wanted it to be, and that genuine engagement that paid attention to what the cave actually was, rather than to what it seemed to be, or what it was useful for, produced genuine understanding. The scientific tradition has confirmed this at the level of empirical finding. Every time a researcher has approached Mammoth Cave with the humility to let the evidence revise their expectations rather than the other way around, the cave has produced findings that exceeded those expectations. The connection to the Flint Ridge system exceeded expectations. The age and sophistication of the prehistoric mining exceeded expectations. The diversity and distinctiveness of the cave's biological community exceeded expectations. The extent of the paleoclimate record preserved in the speleothems exceeded expectations. The evidence of unmapped passage systems beyond the current boundaries of the known cave has exceeded expectations. The cave has consistently been larger, older, more complex, and more significant than any research program approaching it brought as its prior assumption. The elder traditions were expressing this pattern in cosmological language when they said the cave was vast and inhabited by things unlike anything on the surface, and connected to a world that operated by different rules. They were encoding the experiential truth of an extended observational tradition into a framework designed for transmission and preservation, and they were accurate in their encoding of the fundamental claims. The cave is exactly as extraordinary as the traditions described. The traditions were not exaggerating. They were, if anything, underspecific, because the vocabulary available to them for describing the cave's biological uniqueness and geological complexity and paleoclimate significance did not include terms like chemolithotrophy or speleothem or paleoclimatology. They described what they could observe and what they could infer from observation in the vocabulary available to them, and they were accurate. What they observed was a cave that went further than any person had traveled into it, that was inhabited by things unlike the things of the surface, and that rewarded careful, humble, sustained engagement with genuine understanding of the nature of the world. That is what Mammoth Cave is. The elders were right, the science confirms it. And the cave, 400 miles mapped and still extending beyond the furthest passage that any person has yet entered, is ready to confirm more of it, for whoever comes next with enough light and enough humility to engage with what is actually there rather than with what they expected to find. The darkness is honest. Go carefully. There is no end to it. The story that Mammoth Cave tells about the relationship between human beings and the natural world is not a simple one, and it does not resolve into a comfortable conclusion. It is a story about knowledge and loss and partial recovery, about the extraordinary capacity of oral traditions to preserve accurate information across enormous timescales, about the ways in which colonial disruption of those traditions constituted a scientific loss as well as a human one, about the gradual, incomplete but genuine process of recognizing that loss and beginning to address it through collaborative research frameworks that treat indigenous knowledge with appropriate seriousness. It is a story about a cave that is genuinely astonishing, that was known and engaged with over thousands of years in ways that produced real knowledge, that was then appropriated and commercially exploited and partially explored in ways that missed much of what had already been understood about it. And that is now being approached, slowly and imperfectly, but with growing sophistication, in ways that combine modern scientific tools with the fragments of traditional knowledge that survived the disruptions of history. The cave rewards this approach. It has always rewarded genuine engagement with what it actually is, rather than with what anyone expected it to be. It will continue to reward such engagement for as long as any human institution maintains the patience and the humility to pursue it, because the cave is still larger than the light anyone carries into it. It is still older and more complex and more significant than any single research program has yet fully accounted for. It is still extending, in the dark, beyond the furthest passage that any person has entered in any era. And what lies in those unlit passages is real. The elder traditions said something waited there. Science is finding that something waits there. What exactly it is, in its full character, remains to be discovered. But the direction the warnings were pointing has proved reliable, and the investigation continues in that direction, carrying better light than any previous generation has had available, looking for what has been waiting since before any human being arrived in North America to look. The elders were right. The cave has no end. The scientists are still looking. The darkness is patient. And the cave, extraordinary in every quality that has been measured, and likely extraordinary in qualities that have not yet been measured, is waiting for the investigators who will arrive with enough skill and enough humility to understand what they find in the deepest passages, and enough sense to bring that understanding back to the people who sent them. As those first torch-carrying people understood, when they went in and found what they found, and came back to tell the others. As the traditions they established understood, when they encoded what had been found in forms designed to survive the millennia. As the scientists are beginning to understand, when the evidence they find in the cave confirms what the traditions preserved. The cave is the teacher. The darkness is the curriculum. The light we carry is always smaller than the dark we enter. Go carefully. Pay attention. Come back and tell the others. The cave has no end, and what waits in the deeper passages is real. The elders were right. Scientists finally looked. The looking is not done. One of the most consequential aspects of the Mammoth Cave story that rarely receives adequate attention is the role that enslaved black guides played in the development of scientific and public knowledge about the cave. The centrality of Stephen Bishop and the Bransford family to the cave's exploration history has been documented by historians, but it has not been adequately integrated into the mainstream account of the cave's significance or into the public interpretation of its history at the national park level. Understanding that centrality is essential for an honest account of how knowledge about Mammoth Cave was produced and accumulated. Stephen Bishop arrived at the cave in 1838, when Franklin Gorin purchased the property and brought him there as part of the enslaved workforce that would develop the cave as a commercial attraction. Bishop was approximately 17 years old. He had no prior experience of the cave and no scientific training in any formal sense. What he had was intelligence, physical courage, spatial reasoning of an exceptional order, and the capacity for sustained, detailed observation that is the foundation of any genuine scientific work, regardless of what institutional credentials accompany it. Within a few years of his arrival at Mammoth Cave, Bishop had become the most knowledgeable person living about the cave's interior geography. He crossed the bottomless pit, a feature that had halted previous exploration attempts, by constructing a ladder from available materials and descending into it, then ascending and continuing into passages that no person had previously entered. He named those passages with a combination of aesthetic sensibility and descriptive precision, giving them names like Cleveland Avenue and Cleveland's Cabinet and the Chief City and Gorin's Dome that reflected both the cave's physical character and the social world in which Bishop operated. He identified the cave's major geological features and developed a navigational understanding of the passage system's large-scale geography that was superior to anything a casual visitor or even a repeated visitor without his sustained engagement could develop. His map, drawn in the 1840s and published in Bullitt's Guide to the Cave, was the most accurate representation of the cave's known passages for decades. Modern comparative analysis of his map against the now complete survey of the cave's historic sections shows it to be remarkably accurate, given the instruments available to him, which consisted primarily of his own memory, spatial reasoning, and observational notes rather than any systematic surveying equipment. He was doing what cave cartographers do, building an internal spatial model of a complex three-dimensional environment from repeated traversals of it, and he was doing it with a precision that reflects both natural aptitude and the kind of sustained, attentive engagement that genuine knowledge requires. Bishop died in 1857, a few years after he was finally freed under the terms of the will of John Croghan, who had purchased him along with the cave property, and who died of tuberculosis in 1849. The cave was willed to Croghan's nephews, and Bishop was freed in 1856, just over a year before his death. He is buried in the Old Guide Cemetery near the cave's historic entrance. The Bransford family continued the tradition Bishop established. Matt Bransford, who had been enslaved at the cave, worked as a guide after emancipation and was described by visitors who encountered him in the late 19th century as among the most knowledgeable guides in the cave's history, with an encyclopedic familiarity with the cave's passages and a narrative eloquence in explaining its features to visitors that made the experience genuinely educational rather than merely spectacular. His son, Nick Bransford, and his grandson, Henry Bransford, continued the family's engagement with the cave, maintaining across 3 generations the kind of sustained, careful, attentive relationship with a specific place that produces the deepest understanding of it. The knowledge that the Bransford family accumulated across those 3 generations was not identical to the knowledge held by the prehistoric miners or by the native oral traditions, but it was of the same fundamental character. It was knowledge produced by sustained, organized, multi-generational engagement with a specific place, embedded in practices of transmission and refinement that maintained its accuracy and extended its depth over time. And like the indigenous oral traditions, it was knowledge produced by people who had no institutional power in the standard sense, whose contributions were appropriated by the people who held formal authority over the place, and whose historical significance was consistently underrepresented in the official account of the cave's discovery and development. The recognition of Fwesub's and the Bransford family's contributions is part of the ongoing reckoning with the cave's full history that Mammoth Cave National Park has been, slowly and incompletely, pursuing. It is part of the same process of honest historical accounting that the recognition of native peoples' prior and sustained engagement with the cave represents. The cave's history was produced by multiple communities, multiple traditions of knowledge, multiple forms of engagement with its character. An honest account of that history has to include all of them, including the ones whose contributions were most systematically erased by the people who benefited most from them. The cave itself does not make those distinctions. Its passages are equally illuminated by any torch, regardless of who carries it. Its minerals are equally extractable by any tool capable of scraping them from the wall, regardless of who made the tool. Its biological communities are equally observable by anyone with eyes and sufficient time and attention, regardless of what formal training that person has or has not received. The cave is indifferent to the social categories that the human beings who enter it bring with them. It is equally patient with everyone who approaches it honestly. The people who approached it most honestly, over the longest periods, with the most sustained and careful attention, were not the commercially motivated owners and developers who profited from it most visibly. They were the prehistoric miners who went 3 miles into the dark to scrape mineral from walls by torchlight, the communities that transmitted knowledge about what those miners found across 4,000 years of oral tradition, the enslaved guides whose intimate familiarity with the cave's interior was the foundation of the commercial enterprise that exploited it, and the descendants of those guides who maintained that familiarity across generations after the legal structure of slavery had been abolished. Their contributions are part of the cave's story. An honest account of the cave's history has to include them. An honest science of the cave's natural and cultural history has to build on them, not simply acknowledge them as historical background before proceeding with the modern investigation that supersedes them. The modern investigation does not supersede the knowledge accumulated by these prior traditions. It adds to it. It confirms parts of it, extends it in directions those traditions did not have the tools to pursue, and opens questions that the traditions pointed toward but could not answer with the resources available to them. The relationship is additive, not replacement. Understanding the cave more fully requires drawing on all of these traditions of knowledge, which means developing the institutional practices and research frameworks capable of doing so. Those practices and frameworks are being developed. The development is slow and uneven and resisted in some quarters by institutional inertia and by researchers committed to models of knowledge production that do not easily incorporate the forms of knowledge embedded in oral tradition and in the accumulated wisdom of extended engagement with specific places. But it is happening, and the cave, patient as always, is there waiting for the results. The cave does not need the investigation to continue. It existed for hundreds of millions of years before human beings arrived to investigate it. It will exist for hundreds of millions of years after whatever human civilization currently occupies the surface above it has run its course. The investigation is for the benefit of the people conducting it and the communities they are part of, not for the benefit of the cave. The cave is not improved by being understood, but the people who understand it are improved in ways that matter for how they understand themselves, their history, their relationships to the natural world, and the kinds of knowledge that are possible and valuable and worth pursuing. Understanding Mammoth Cave more fully is understanding the continent's history more fully. It is understanding the complexity and sophistication of the pre-Columbian cultural world more accurately. It is understanding the mechanisms by which knowledge is produced, preserved, transmitted, and lost more clearly. It is understanding the relationship between scientific investigation and other forms of knowledge production more honestly. It is understanding the history of what colonization disrupted and what fragments survived, and what those fragments can still tell us if we take them seriously. All of that understanding is worth pursuing, The cave makes it possible to pursue it more fully than almost any other single site in North America, because the combination of qualities it presents is so extraordinary and so comprehensive. The geological uniqueness, the biological distinctiveness, the paleoclimate significance, the archaeological richness, the depth and accuracy of the associated oral traditions, the documented contributions of enslaved guides, the ongoing research that continues to find confirmation of what prior engagement had discovered. All of this, in one place, one extraordinary dark place beneath the Kentucky hills that has been rewarding, careful, humble, sustained attention for 4,000 years and continues to do so. The elders warned about what was beneath Mammoth Cave for 1,000 years, and more than 1,000 years, across every disruption and catastrophe that history imposed on the communities that held the knowledge. They were right about what they were warning about. Scientists finally looked, systematically and with modern tools, and found confirmation of the fundamental claims those warnings were making. The cave is vast. The cave is inhabited by things unlike anything on the surface. The cave connects to a world that operates by different rules. The cave rewards careful, humble engagement, with genuine understanding that is not available any other way. That is what the warnings were saying. That is what the science has confirmed. That is the story of Mammoth Cave, told honestly. The darkness is real. The extent is real. The biological distinctiveness is real. The archaeological record is real. The oral traditions were accurate. The science is confirming it. The cave is not done, revealing what it holds. Go carefully when you enter. Pay attention to what is actually there rather than to what you expected to find. Come back and tell the others what you found. That is what the people who went first did. They came back and they told the others, and the others passed it on, and it was passed on across 4,000 years, and it was still accurate enough when it finally reached people with the tools to test it that the fundamental claims were confirmed. That is the story. That is the lesson. That is the truth of what is beneath Mammoth Cave. The elders warned about it. The scientists looked. The cave confirmed what the warnings said. The looking is not done. The darkness is honest. Go carefully. There is no end to it, and there is no end to what it can teach us. If we approach it the way the people who knew it best approached it, with knowledge, with humility, with respect for what was there before us and will be there after us, with the willingness to be surprised by what is actually in the dark, rather than insisting that the dark contain only what we already expected to find. The cave is waiting. The elders were right. The scientists are learning, and the darkness, deep and honest and genuinely vast, is holding what it always held, waiting for the light that is capable of seeing it clearly. That light is still being developed. The research is still ongoing. The collaboration between scientific investigation and indigenous knowledge traditions is still maturing. The understanding of what Mammoth Cave truly is, in all of its geological and biological and archaeological and cultural and epistemological significance, is still being assembled. But the direction is clear. The warnings pointed there. The science has confirmed the pointing. The investigation continues in that direction. And the cave, 400 miles mapped, and extending beyond that into an unknown further extent, is there, in the dark beneath the Kentucky hills, exactly as extraordinary as the elders said it was. Exactly. The question of what the prehistoric mining of Mammoth Cave meant to the communities that conducted it deserves more attention than the archaeological literature has typically given it, partly because that question is the one most productively addressed through the integration of oral tradition with material evidence, and partly because the answer to it opens into the broader questions of what pre-Columbian North American civilization was capable of and what it was trying to do. Gypsum, the mineral that the prehistoric miners extracted from Mammoth Cave's walls, is not a rare or exotic material in the geological sense. It occurs in many environments across North America, and surface deposits are not uncommon in the karst landscapes of the eastern and central United States. The choice to travel miles into complete darkness to obtain it, when surface sources existed, was not an economic necessity in any simple sense. It was a choice that reflected something about the specific character of cave-obtained gypsum that surface-obtained gypsum did not share. That something was almost certainly cosmological. Cave gypsum was different from surface gypsum, not in its chemistry, but in where it came from. It came from the underworld. It was a material that had been forming in complete darkness, in the presence of whatever inhabited the underground spaces, shaped by the same geological processes that created the cave's other features, embedded in the same cosmological significance that the cave itself held. The oral traditions of the eastern woodlands consistently associate the underground with a set of cosmological meanings that would make materials obtained from underground spaces cosmologically significant in ways that surface materials of identical chemical composition would not be. The underground is a realm of power, of the older and deeper layers of reality, of the sources of forces that affect the surface world. Materials obtained from that realm carry its character with them. To bring gypsum from miles inside the earth, from the darkness where things lived that were unlike things on the surface, was to bring back a piece of that underworld's reality into the surface world. The gypsum was not just a mineral, it was a conduit, a connection between the world above and the world below, a material whose value was inseparable from the circumstances of its extraction. This cosmological interpretation of the cave-obtained gypsum explains several features of the archaeological record that are difficult to account for purely on utilitarian grounds. It explains why the mining continued for centuries even though surface gypsum was available. It explains why the gypsum appears in burial contexts and ritual assemblages rather than in the utilitarian debris of everyday life. It explains why the communities that used the cave treated the relationship with it as a sustained institutional responsibility rather than as an occasional resource extraction opportunity. And it explains why the knowledge of the cave was embedded in the cosmological framework of the broader cultural world of the eastern woodlands, transmitted through the same channels as other significant cosmological knowledge, and preserved with the care that significant cosmological knowledge deserved. Understanding the cave use in these terms does not require abandoning scientific rigor. It requires expanding the interpretive framework beyond purely utilitarian explanation to include the cosmological dimensions of the behavior being studied. That expansion is what the collaboration between archaeological investigation and indigenous knowledge traditions makes possible. The oral traditions provide the interpretive framework. The material evidence provides the specifics that the framework helps explain. Together, they produce a more complete account of what was happening in Mammoth Cave 3,000 years ago than either alone can provide. The more complete account is more interesting, more significant, and more useful for understanding the broader history of pre-Columbian North American culture than the purely utilitarian account of people going into a cave to get a mineral they needed. The more complete account is about communities with sophisticated cosmological frameworks conducting organized religious and economic activities in an underground space, developing real knowledge about that space over centuries of sustained engagement, and transmitting that knowledge in forms designed for long-term preservation. That is a significantly more impressive and significantly more relevant story, both for what it tells us about the specific case of Mammoth Cave and for what it tells us about the cultural complexity and intellectual sophistication of pre-Columbian Eastern Woodlands communities. The intellectual sophistication is not a matter of debate among the researchers who have engaged most carefully with the evidence. The question is how that sophistication is described and what implications are drawn from it for the broader understanding of pre-Columbian North American history. The implication that the researchers who take the oral traditions seriously tend to draw is that the standard account of pre-Columbian North America, which persistently underestimates the complexity and sophistication of indigenous cultures in ways that have served to justify the colonial project that displaced them, needs substantial revision. The Mammoth Cave story is one of the pieces of evidence that supports that revision. The 4,000 years of organized, purposeful engagement with the cave's interior, the accuracy of the oral traditions that carried knowledge about that engagement across generations, and the confirmation by modern science of the fundamental claims those traditions made, all point toward a pre-Columbian world that was operating at a level of cultural and intellectual sophistication that the standard account systematically fails to convey. That revision is ongoing. It is being driven by archaeological discoveries, by the application of new analytical methods to existing collections, by the development of collaborative research frameworks that incorporate indigenous knowledge more systematically, and by the growing body of scientific confirmation of the fundamental claims that oral traditions have been making about North American landscapes for longer than any written record has existed. The Mammoth Cave story is part of that larger revision, and it is one of its most compelling examples because the combination of qualities it presents, the extraordinary cave, the sophisticated prehistoric use, the deep and accurate oral traditions, the scientific confirmation of their fundamental claims, is available in such concentrated and well-documented form in a single place. The revision is also being driven by the people most directly affected by the standard account's inadequacies. Descendant communities of the peoples who developed and maintained relationships with the Mammoth Cave region over thousands of years have an obvious and direct stake in the revision of that account, and they have been increasingly active participants in the research programs that are producing the evidence for revision. Their participation is not merely political, though it is also political. It is epistemological. They bring perspectives and frameworks and bodies of knowledge to the research programs that produce better questions and better findings. The research is better when they are in the room designing it. The findings are more complete when the knowledge they hold is integrated with the knowledge produced by scientific investigation. The account that emerges is more accurate when it includes what they know. This is the practical argument for the collaborative research frameworks that are being developed. Not that it is morally right to include indigenous communities in the research programs that study their ancestors, though it is. Not that the law requires consultation, though it does. But that the research produces better results when it is designed and conducted collaboratively. The knowledge is more complete. The questions are more productive. The findings are more significant. The account that emerges is more accurate. That is the pragmatic case for collaboration, and it is supported by the evidence from the research programs where collaboration has been sustained long enough to produce results. Mammoth Cave is one of the places where that case can be most clearly made, because the depth of the oral tradition associated with it, and the accuracy of that tradition's fundamental claims as confirmed by scientific investigation, makes the epistemological argument for taking indigenous knowledge seriously as concrete and specific as it can be made anywhere in the North American record. The tradition said the cave was vast. The science found the longest cave system on Earth. The tradition said the deeper passages were inhabited by things unlike anything on the surface. The science found a biological community unlike anything on the surface of this continent, evolved over millions of years in complete darkness. The tradition said the cave had no end. The science has mapped 400 miles and continues to find more. These correspondences are not ambiguous. They are clear, specific, and significant, and they are the basis on which the further investigation should be designed. What does the tradition say about what waits at the furthest extent of the cave's passages? It says something is there, that the cave in its deepest portions contains something whose nature is significant, and whose relationship to the human communities above it is real. The tradition does not specify what that something is in terms that modern biology or geology can directly evaluate. But the tradition has proved accurate on every testable claim it has made about the cave's character. The appropriate response to a tradition with that track record, when it makes a claim that is not yet testable, is to design the investigation that would make it testable and then conduct the investigation. That investigation, in this case, involves going deeper into the cave than any current research program has gone, with the tools and the collaborative frameworks capable of understanding what is found there. In light of what the tradition has been pointing toward and what the science has been confirming along the way, the investigation is not yet complete. The cave's deepest passages have not yet been physically entered by any investigator equipped with modern analytical tools. The geophysical surveys suggesting major unmapped passage systems beyond the current boundaries of the known cave have not yet been followed up with physical exploration in most cases. The sediment in the deep chambers has not been fully analyzed. The biological surveys of the cave's aquatic ecosystem are ongoing but incomplete. There is more to find. The elders said so. The science is confirming it, one discovery at a time. And the darkness, patient and honest and genuinely vast, is there waiting for the investigators who will arrive with enough skill and enough humility to finally understand what has been there all along. The cave has no end. That was the warning. That is the truth. And the truth of it is still being discovered, in passages that no one has yet entered, in a darkness that is the oldest darkness in North America, carrying within it the accumulated history of 330 million years of geological process and millions of years of biological evolution and 4,000 years of human engagement, and the fragments of the knowledge that those 4,000 years produced. The darkness is honest. The cave is patient. The warnings were accurate. Scientists have finally looked. The looking is not done, and whatever waits at the deepest end of the longest cave on Earth is still there, in the dark, exactly where the elders said it would be, waiting for the light that is capable of understanding it. Go carefully when you enter. Pay attention to what is actually there. Come back and tell the others. That is what the people who went first understood. That is what 4,000 years of accumulated knowledge preserved. That is what the science is confirming, one discovery at a time, in one of the most extraordinary places in North America. The elders warned about what was beneath Mammoth Cave for 1,000 years, and more. Scientists finally looked. The cave confirmed everything the warnings said about it. The looking is not done. The darkness is vast, and honest, and patient, and it is waiting. There is one more thing that needs to be said about Mammoth Cave. One final dimension of the story that the elder warnings were encoding and that the science is still working to fully account for. The cave is not only an extraordinary geological and biological system, it is a place whose relationship to the water table of the entire surrounding region means that what happens in the cave's passages is connected to what happens in every well, every spring, every stream, and every river in the karst landscape above it. The Green River is fed, in part, by springs that emerge from the cave system. The groundwater that communities in the surrounding region draw from wells is moving through the same limestone formation that the cave's passages occupy. The cave is not an isolated system. It is the visible expression of a hydrological network that underlies and sustains the surface landscape above it. The elder traditions associated with the cave consistently describe this connection. The cave was understood as connected to the water system of the surrounding landscape, as a controlling influence on the availability and character of the water that emerged from the earth above. This understanding had practical implications for how communities managed their relationship with the cave region. You did not simply exploit the cave's resources without considering the effect on the system the cave was part of. The cave was part of the water. The water was part of the landscape. The landscape was the foundation of everything the communities above depended on. This systems-level understanding of the cave's role in the regional ecology is something that modern hydrological science has confirmed through the same kind of sustained, careful investigation that has confirmed the other fundamental claims of the oral traditions. The Green River karst system, of which Mammoth Cave is the most visible component, is a connected hydrological network. What enters the cave's passages through sinkholes on the surface above emerges from springs at the cave's discharge points. The chemistry of the water moving through the system reflects the geology it has traversed and the biological communities it has passed through. The cave is not separate from the surface landscape. It is the underground infrastructure of that landscape's water cycle. The elder traditions understood this. They described the cave as a presence that sustained the surface world above it, as connected to the water and therefore to the life that the water supported. Modern hydrology has confirmed the connection. The cave is part of the regional water cycle. What happens in the cave affects the water that emerges from the land above. The relationship is real, and it operates in exactly the direction the traditions described. This is, in its way, the most practically significant confirmation of the oral tradition's accuracy, because it is the confirmation with the most direct implications for how human communities should manage their relationship with the cave and with the karst landscape it underlies. If the cave is connected to the regional water supply, and it is, then the health of the cave's aquifer and the integrity of the cave's geological and biological system are not simply heritage concerns. They are water supply concerns. They are public health concerns. They are the concerns of every community that draws water from the karst landscape of south-central Kentucky. The elders who warned that the cave needed to be approached with care, that it needed to be engaged with respect rather than exploited, that it was connected to everything above it, and its character affected the character of the surface world, were not only describing a cosmological relationship, they were describing a hydrological reality that modern science has confirmed. The cave is connected to the water. The water is connected to everything the surface communities depend on. Treating the cave with respect is not only culturally appropriate, it is ecologically necessary. That is the final and perhaps most practical confirmation of the warning's accuracy. The elders were right about the hydrology, they were right about the biology, they were right about the extent, they were right about the character, and they were right that the cave was worth protecting and approaching with the kind of careful, sustained, respectful engagement that they had developed over thousands of years of living in relationship with it. Scientists finally looked. The cave confirmed the warnings in every direction they pointed. The looking is not done. The cave holds what it always held. 400 miles of honest darkness beneath the Kentucky hills. The elders warned. Scientists looked. Both were right.